The memory was a persistent ghost, a fragment of childhood that had taken root in Ilara's soul and refused to let go. It was her grandmother's voice, low and crackling like an old record, spinning tales not of princesses and dragons, but of the ancient breathing woods that bordered their town. She spoke of Epping Forest as a place where the veil between worlds was thin, where the past was not a distant country but a living presence, whispering from the gnarled oaks and rustling in the bracken. That voice, and the stories it carried, was the compass that now guided Ilara's steps as she crossed from the car park's tarmac into the forest's deepening green. Dusk was her chosen hour, the time of in-between, when shadows grew long and substance began to bleed into spirit. The air cooled rapidly, carrying the rich, damp scent of leaf mold and decay. The path, a ribbon of beaten earth, wound away from the known world and into a cathedral of trees. Their branches, intertwined overhead, formed a vaulted ceiling that filtered the dying light into a murky green-tinted gloom. Almost immediately, the sounds of the modern world faded, replaced by the forest's own symphony, the sigh of the wind, the scuttling of unseen creatures, and something else. A susurration, a soft, sibilant whisper that seemed to emanate from the very bark of the trees. It was not one voice, but many, a chorus of indistinct murmurs that coiled around her, sometimes sounding like her name, other times like a warning. She walked with a purposeful stride, her notebook a comforting weight in her coat pocket, a camera hanging ready from her neck. Her research had led her here, to the legend of a highwayman, a rogue named Black Jack, who had haunted these very lanes 2 centuries prior. His reign of terror had ended at the end of a rope, his body left to swing from a great oak as a grisly warning. The official records called it justice, but her grandmother's stories spoke of a curse, of a spirit too restless to find peace. A flicker of movement in her peripheral vision snapped her head to the left. Between the thick trunks, a shadow detached itself from the greater darkness, a tall, man-shaped silhouette that stood perfectly still for a heartbeat before melting back into the woods. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She raised her camera, but the viewfinder showed only a tangle of branches and ferns. Nothing. She took a steadying breath, the cool air stinging her lungs, and continued, the feeling of being watched intensifying with every step. It was a physical pressure between her shoulder blades, an unseen gaze tracking her progress. She found the oak an hour later, its location marked on her old, hand-drawn map. It was a monstrous, ancient thing, its trunk so wide 3 people could not have encircled it. One thick lower limb, worn smooth in a single sinister band, reached out over the path like an accusatory finger. This was the place. Ilara stopped, her boots sinking slightly into the soft ground. She pulled out her notebook, her fingers trembling as she scribbled down the details, the girth of the tree, the texture of the bark, the oppressive silence that had fallen around it. The whispers had ceased. In their absence, the quiet felt heavy, expectant. As she wrote, a cold dread began to pool in her stomach. The presence was no longer just watching. It was close. She could feel it in the chill that raised the hairs on her arms, in the way the forest seemed to be holding its breath. She slowly closed her notebook and tucked it away, her eyes scanning the deepening shadows. There was nothing to see, only the gathering night and the skeletal fingers of the branches against the violet sky. Yet she knew, with a certainty that chilled her more than the evening air, that she was not alone. The story of Black Jack was no longer just words on a page or a memory from her grandmother's lap. It was here, in the cold and the dark, walking silently beside her. If Epping Forest was a place of whispers, then Wistman's Wood was a land of screams frozen in time. Nestled in a high valley on Dartmoor, the wood was not so much a collection of trees as a petrified army of ancient stunted oaks, their branches twisted into agonized arthritic shapes by centuries of wind and a deep abiding sorrow. Locals in the nearby pub had spoken of it in hushed tones over pints of warm ale, their eyes darting toward the moors. They spoke not of a single ghost, but of a chorus of them. Hellhounds with eyes of burning coal and breath of sulphur, the lingering curses of druids who had performed unspeakable rites amongst the mossy boulders. They called it a place where the soil itself remembered pain. Elara stepped into the wood, and the world changed. The air grew thick and still, the bright moorland light dimming as if filtered through stained glass. The trees were a dense, low canopy of gnarled limbs, their bark furred with a lush, almost unnatural blanket of moss and polypody ferns. A labyrinth of granite boulders, some as large as cars, lay strewn between the trunks, carpeted in the same vibrant green. It was impossibly, eerily beautiful, a scene from a forgotten fairy tale where beauty was a trap. The silence was absolute, a heavy blanket smothering the usual sounds of the countryside. No birds sang here, no insects buzzed. She moved slowly, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of moss and dead leaves. The twisted oaks seemed to lean in, their branches like clutching fingers. She ran a hand over the cool, damp bark of one, feeling the deep ridges and valleys of its long life. Her grandmother had never spoken of this place, and Elara felt a sudden, sharp pang of loneliness. Here, the stories felt less like folklore and more like warnings carved into the very landscape. She documented the scene with her camera, the flash stark and intrusive against the deep green gloom, capturing the way the roots snaked over the rocks like great wooden serpents. It was then that the fog began to roll in. It did not creep, but poured over the lip of the valley in a silent, milky tide, swallowing the distant tors and then the nearer trees. Within minutes, the world contracted to a radius of a few feet. The twisted oaks became spectral forms in the mist, their shapes shifting and seeming to move when she looked away. The air grew damp and cold, clinging to her skin and clothes. Her sense of direction, usually so reliable, dissolved into the opaque whiteness. She was utterly alone in a silent, formless world. Pushing deeper, driven by a compulsion she could not name, she stumbled into a small clearing dominated by a circle of stones. They were not the grand monoliths of a henge, but smaller, waist-high rocks, their surfaces unnaturally smooth and marked with faint, weathered carvings she could not decipher. They felt arranged, purposeful. This was a place of power. The air hummed with a low, sub-audible frequency that vibrated in her teeth. She knelt, tracing the spirals and zigzag lines with a gloved finger, feeling a jolt of cold energy shoot up her arm. This was older than the Druids, older than the legends of hellhounds. This was primal. A sound cut through the dead silence, so sudden and visceral it stopped her heart. A low, guttural growl, rumbling from the fog-shrouded trees to her left. It was not the sound of a dog or a fox. It was deeper, thicker, a noise that promised torn flesh and shattered bone. It was the sound of pure predatory hunger. Another answered from her right, closer this time. Fear, cold and sharp, injected itself into her veins. The intellectual curiosity that had driven her this far evaporated, replaced by a base, animal instinct to flee. She scrambled to her feet, her breath coming in ragged white puffs. The growls came again, now from multiple directions, closing in. She could see nothing but the swirling fog and the dark, twisted shapes of the oaks. Were they just trees, or were they something else? Something watching, waiting? She turned and ran, her boots slipping on the slick moss, her shoulder clipping a granite boulder with a jarring thud. She did not stop. She crashed through the undergrowth, branches tearing at her coat and hair, the guttural sounds pursuing her, seeming to pace her just beyond the veil of mist. The boundary between myth and reality, a line she had spent her life studying, had not just blurred, it had shattered. The hellhounds were real. The curse was real, and they were hunting her. She ran until her lungs burned and the fog began to thin, bursting out of the wood and onto the open moor, not stopping until the terrible silent pressure of the wood was far behind her, leaving only the echo of growls and the terrifying knowledge that some stories are written not in ink, but in blood and shadow. The earth remembers its wounds, and in the forest of Dean, the scars ran deep. Beneath the vibrant canopy of oaken beech lay a subterranean world of forgotten toil, a labyrinth of tunnels where the air itself seemed to carry the weight of centuries. Elara felt it the moment she left the sun-dappled paths, a profound shift from the living forest above to the spectral one below. The ground beneath her feet was pockmarked with the remnants of old mine entrances, some gaping like open mouths, others sealed with rusted iron grates and crumbling stone. It was here, amidst the ghosts of industry, that the past felt most like a physical presence, a cold breath on the back of her neck. She had come seeking the stories of the free miners, men and boys who had carved a life from the rock, their existence measured in tons of coal and the diminishing light of their lamps. Local archives spoke of collapses, of pockets of foul air that snuffed out lives in an instant, of the slow, grinding poverty that was the true price of the coal they dug. But it was the oral histories, the tales passed down in hushed tones that spoke of the echoes that never faded. They said that on certain nights, if you pressed your ear to the cold ground, you could still hear the rhythmic clink, clink, clink of pickaxes striking stone, and the faint, mournful strains of miners' songs carried on a breeze that did not stir the leaves above. Ilara chose a tunnel that looked less forbidding than the others, its entrance a low, arched mouth of damp brick, partially obscured by a curtain of ivy. Ducking inside, she was immediately swallowed by an oppressive darkness, the humid air thick with the smell of wet earth, rust and something else, the faint, acrid tang of old coal dust. She switched on her powerful torch, its beam cutting a swath through the black, illuminating walls that glittered with embedded minerals and the twin ribbons of a narrow-gauge railway track, long since seized with rust. The sounds of the forest vanished, replaced by the drip of water and the frantic scuttling of unseen things. And then she heard it. It was not with her ears, but a vibration in her bones, a distant, rhythmic percussion, the ghost of industry. Clink, clink, clink. It was joined by a sound like a chorus of distant male voices humming a tune without melody, a wordless, weary dirge that seemed to emanate from the very rock around her. The air grew colder, causing her breath to plume in the torchlight. She moved forward, drawn by the phantom symphony, her boots crunching on the gravel bed. The tunnel branched, and she followed the sound, the echoes guiding her deeper into the mountain's heart. It was at a junction where 3 tunnels met that she saw him, a small figure, no taller than her waist, standing perfectly still in the beam of her torch. He was a boy, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, but his form was insubstantial, a shimmer in the air like heat haze over tarmac. His clothes were ragged, his face and hands covered in a fine grey soot that should have been black. He did not look at her with eyes, for his features were blurred, but she felt his. Attention, a desperate, silent plea. He raised a translucent hand, not in greeting, but in a beckoning gesture, then turned and drifted soundlessly down the left-hand tunnel. A primal fear urged her to turn back, to flee the crushing weight of the earth above. But a deeper, more compelling need, the same one that had sent her into Epping and Wistman's Wood, propelled her forward. She followed the small, shimmering form, the phantom pickaxe sounds growing fainter, replaced by a new, more profound silence. The boy led her for what felt like an age, through passages that grew narrower and lower, until they reached a dead end. It was not a natural wall. Before her was a brutal, deliberate closure, a solid wall of newly mortared brick, stark and unnatural against the ancient hewn rock. It sealed the tunnel completely. The soot-covered child stopped before it, his faint form seeming to solidify for a moment. He lifted his hand again and pointed a trembling, spectral finger at the center of the brickwork. Then he simply faded, dissolving into the cold, still air, until nothing remained but the memory of his presence, and the profound sense of tragedy that clung to the place. Ilara stood before the sealed shaft, her torch beam illuminating the unyielding brick. This was no mere collapse. This was a tomb. She imagined the panic, the desperate scratching at rock, the final suffocating darkness. The forgotten tragedy was not just a story in a book. It was here, trapped behind this wall. The souls of those lost were not wandering the forest. They were imprisoned in this cold, silent darkness, their final moments echoing through time. She reached out, her fingertips brushing the rough, cold mortar, and a jolt of pure, undiluted sorrow shot through her. A legacy of pain sealed in stone, a silent scream from the depths of the earth. The name Sherwood conjured images of heroic outlaws and daring escapades, a romantic tapestry woven from ballads and folklore. But Ilara had learned that beneath the veneer of every celebrated legend lay a darker, more visceral truth. Here, beyond the tourist trails and the gilded tales of Robin Hood, the forest kept older, grimmer secrets. The local reports spoke not of stolen gold returned to the poor, but of spectral figures lurking in the thickets, of the creak of a phantom gallows, and of hanged men seen swinging from the boughs of the major oak's ancient kin. It was this undercurrent of raw justice and brutal vengeance that drew her deeper into the woodland's heart, away from the myth and into the memory. The air in Sherwood was different from the oppressive stillness of Wistman's Wood or the subterranean chill of the Forest of Dean. It felt watchful, charged with the residual energy of centuries of conflict between law and desperation. Sunlight dappled the forest floor through a canopy of magnificent oaks and beeches, but the light seemed to avoid certain patches, leaving pockets of deep, persistent shadow that felt colder than the rest. Elara moved with a quiet purpose, her senses attuned to the subtleties of the place. She found the first sign not far from a disused footpath, in a small secluded clearing dominated by a single gnarled oak. There, dangling from a thick, low-hanging branch, was a noose. It was old, the rope frayed and greyed by years of weather, the fibres coarse and brittle to the touch. It hung perfectly still in the windless air, a stark, ugly statement against the vibrant green of the leaves. This was no prop, no piece of theatrical decoration for visitors. It felt authentic, a relic left to rot, or perhaps to wait. The ground beneath it was bare, as if nothing would grow in that cursed circle. Ilara's camera felt heavy in her hands as she documented it, the click of the shutter unnaturally loud in the quiet glade. The romantic heroism of Robin Hood felt a million miles away. This was the blunt, unforgiving instrument of the law, a symbol of finality that needed no ballads to explain it. As afternoon bled into evening, she did not retreat to the safety of her car or a nearby inn. A compulsion held her there, a certainty that the full story only revealed itself after dark. She found a vantage point within a dense thicket of holly, its spiked leaves offering both concealment and a chilling reminder of the Crown's authority. The sunset painted the sky in fiery hues of orange and purple, but as the last light faded, a profound chill settled over the forest. The cheerful birdsong ceased, replaced by the hunting calls of owls and the rustle of nocturnal life. The watchful feeling intensified, the shadows between the great oaks deepening into pools of absolute black. Then, as full night embraced the wood, the shadows began to move. At first it was just a deepening of darkness in one particular area, a coalescing of gloom that took on a vaguely human shape. Then another formed, and another. They were tall, indistinct figures, silhouettes cut from the fabric of the night itself. They moved with a stiff, formal purpose, gathering around the oak with the frayed noose. There was no sound, no rustle of footsteps or murmur of voices, only a silent, grim pantomime playing out before her. One of the shadowy figures, broader than the others, took on the role of authority, his form radiating a cold, judicial menace. Two others dragged a third, slighter figure toward the tree. The victim's form was a swirl of deeper blackness, his struggles silent and futile. With an efficiency born of grim repetition, the noose was placed over his head. There was no dramatic speech, no last words, only the terrible, swift finality of the act. The executioner figure made a sharp downward motion with his hand. The slighter figure jerked, his feet kicking at empty air for a single horrifying moment before he went still, his form now just a dark, dangling shape against the trunk of the oak. The spectral executioners stood for a long moment, observing their handiwork, before their forms simply dissolved, bleeding back into the ordinary shadows of the forest. The hanged man remained for a few seconds longer, a stark testament to the scene, before he too faded into nothingness. The clearing was empty once more, save for the old, frayed rope, still hanging motionless in the dark. Elara remained frozen in her thicket, her breath caught in her throat, her hands clenched into fists so tight her nails bit into her palms. This was not a story of wealth redistributed or tyranny challenged. This was the other side of the legend, the brutal, unchanging echo of the law's ultimate power. It was a cycle of crime and punishment, of justice and vengeance, playing out on an endless loop, a dark stain on the forest's soul that no amount of heroic ballads could ever truly cleanse. The ghost of Robin Hood may have stolen from the rich, but the ghosts of Sherwood served a sterner, more final master. Some forests whispered of ancient history, but Cannock Chase hummed with a distinctly modern dread. Here, the folklore was not of hanged men or druid curses, but of unnatural lights in the sky and phantom predators stalking the misty heathland, a place where contemporary anxieties had taken root and blossomed into terrifying new myths. Ilara arrived under a sky the color of bruised pewter, the air heavy with the promise of rain and something else, a low electrical tension that raised the fine hairs on her arms. The landscape was a sprawling patchwork of dense pine plantations and open heath, a place that felt both managed and utterly wild, where the line between reality and conspiracy theory seemed to fray at the edges. Her research here was a departure from the historical hauntings of her previous stops. The local library's archives were filled not with crumbling parchment, but with blurry photocopies of UFO sighting reports and grainy photographs purporting to show a large black cat, a beast that should not exist in the British countryside. Stories were a bizarre fusion of the extraterrestrial and the terrestrial, of alien abductions and a phantom panther, all centered on this one mist-shrouded expanse. It was a folklore born of headlights and fear, and Ilara felt a strange, unsettling thrill at the shift. She spent the afternoon walking the fire breaks that cut through the regimented pines, the trees standing in silent soldierly rows, their uniformity somehow more unnerving than the chaotic ancient woods. The air was thick with the scent of pine resin and damp earth, and the only sounds were the crunch of her boots on gravel and the distant, lonely cry of a crow. As dusk began to bleed the color from the world, she found a small, relatively clear area to set up her tent, a splash of bright orange nylon against the deep green of the forest floor. The mist, as forecast, began to coil up from the damp ground as the temperature dropped, first as faint tendrils that licked at the tree trunks, then as a solid grey wall that reduced her world to a small, intimate circle of visibility. She cooked a simple meal on her camp stove, the hiss of the gas and the warm smell of rehydrated stew, a comforting anchor in the growing strangeness. But as she finished eating, a profound disorientation settled over her. It was not a dizziness, but a warping of her sense of time itself. She would look at her watch, note that only a minute had passed, and feel with absolute certainty that an hour had slipped by. Then she would become absorbed in arranging her notes, convinced only moments had elapsed, only to find her tea had gone stone cold. The mist seemed to absorb sound and time alike, creating a silent, dislocated bubble where the past, present, and future felt as tangled as the roots beneath the soil. A deep, existential unease coiled in her stomach. This was not the cold dread of a ghost. This was the vertigo of a universe whose rules were momentarily suspended. Then she saw the lights. They appeared directly, overhead, through a brief break in the mist and the pine canopy. Not stars, not aircraft. They were three silent, brilliant orbs of emerald green, arranged in a perfect equilateral triangle. They hung in the sky, motionless and utterly silent, radiating a light that seemed to pulse with a slow, deliberate rhythm, as if communicating in a language of pure energy. Ilara stood frozen, her head craned back, a gasp trapped in her throat. The light did not illuminate the forest. It seemed to absorb it, casting no shadows, making the world around her feel flat and insubstantial. The hum she had felt all day intensified, vibrating in her teeth and bones. For a timeless moment, the triangle hung there, a silent, geometric god in the sky, and then, without accelerating or fading, it was simply gone. The patch of sky was empty, leaving only the afterimage burned onto her retinas and a ringing silence that felt deeper than before. She stumbled back into her tent, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She zipped the door shut, the sound absurdly loud in the quiet, and sat huddled in her sleeping bag, trying to process what she had seen. The temporal disorientation had passed, leaving only a cold, sharp fear. That was when she heard it. From the mist-shrouded darkness beyond the thin nylon wall, a sound, a soft, deliberate crunch of a heavy footstep on the forest floor, then another. It was circling her tent. The footsteps were slow, measured, and possessed a weight that spoke of immense size. She could hear the low, rhythmic puff of its breathing, a deep, guttural sound that was unmistakably feline. It was the big cat, the phantom beast of the modern legends. It was here. Alara held her own breath, her body rigid with terror. The creature continued its slow, predatory circuit, its presence a palpable pressure against the tent fabric. She could smell it now, a feral, musky odor of wet fur and earth that cut through the scent of pine. It paused directly behind her. So close, she imagined she could feel the heat of its body. The low growl that rumbled from its chest was not loud, but it vibrated through the ground and up through her own body, a primal promise of violence that bypassed all reason and spoke directly to the most ancient part of her brain. This was no ghost from a history book. This was a living, breathing nightmare born from the intersection of modern myth and primordial fear, a creature of the chase that had no business existing, yet was here, just inches away, separating her from a brutal end by nothing more than a whisper-thin sheet of nylon. She squeezed her eyes shut, praying for dawn, trapped between the lingering echo of impossible lights in the sky and the very real, very physical terror stalking her in the mist. The haunting of the new forest was not one of singular phantoms or spectral beasts, but a collective, simmering anguish that had seeped into the very soil, a poison brewed from fear, superstition, and the brutal extinguishing of innocent lives. Alara felt it the moment she crossed from the manicured outskirts into the ancient woodland, a subtle shift in the air, a sorrow that clung to the gnarled thorns and the sprawling ancient oaks. This was not a place haunted by the ghost of one woman, but by the echoing terror of hundreds, their stories lost to the official records, but preserved in the trembling leaves and the silent, watchful groves. The history here was not of kings or outlaws, but of ordinary people, mostly women, who had been deemed a threat and brutally erased. She found the old man at the edge of a village that seemed to huddle fearfully against the forest's vastness. He was sitting on a weathered bench outside a pub, whittling a piece of wood with a gnarled, knowing hand. His name was Elias, and his eyes, the color of the forest loam, held a deep, weary knowledge. He did not seem surprised when Alara approached, her intent clear in her notebook and the earnest set of her jaw. He gestured for her to sit, and as the afternoon sun cast long, dappled shadows, he began to speak, his voice a low, rasping whisper that seemed to blend with the rustle of the trees. He spoke not of specific ghosts, but of a time of terror, when a whisper of herbal knowledge or a solitary nature could condemn a soul. He told her of the cursed groves, places the locals still avoided, where the trees grew in twisted, unnatural shapes and the birds refused to nest. He described the trials, not as events of justice, but as public spectacles of cruelty, where the accused, often poor and defenseless, were paraded and broken. His stories were not grand narratives, but intimate tragedies. A mother accused of blighting a neighbor's cow, a young woman whose only crime was beauty that spurned a powerful man's advances, an old widow who knew too much about the healing properties of local plants. Their pleas for mercy, he said, were not recorded in the court documents, but the forest had heard them. The forest remembered. And on certain nights, when the veil was thin, it replayed their final, desperate moments. As dusk fell and Elias retreated into the warmth of the pub, his tales settled heavily upon Alara. The academic distance she usually maintained crumbled, replaced by a raw, empathetic grief for these forgotten women. Driven by a compulsion she could not name, she left the village lights behind and walked back into the woods, guided by the old man's descriptions toward one of the cursed groves. The night was clear and cold, the moon a sharp sliver of silver in a velvet sky, its light doing little to pierce the deep shadows beneath the canopy. She found the clearing exactly as Elias had described, a perfect circle of stunted, twisted hawthorns surrounding a patch of bare, blackened earth. The air within this circle was frigid, a pocket of winter in the mild spring night. The cheerful sounds of the forest, the hoot of an owl, the scuffle of a fox, fell completely silent here, creating a void of sound that was more deafening than any noise. Alara stood at the edge, her heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm of dread and sorrow. Then, the phantom flames began to flicker. They erupted from the blackened earth, not as real fire, but as shimmering, translucent sheets of orange and yellow light that cast no heat and illuminated nothing. They licked silently at the air, their dance a macabre mockery of a celebratory bonfire, and as the spectral fire grew, the whispers began. They rose from all around her, not from the trees, but from the air itself, a chorus of terrified, pleading female voices. "I beg you, I have done nothing. Please, my children, who will care for my children. It was only a poultice for the fever. I swear it. Mercy, in God's name, have mercy." The voices overlapped, a tangled symphony of fear and desperation, some young and trembling, others old and cracked with despair. They were not aggressive, not vengeful. They were simply, heartbreakingly, pleading for a life that had already been stolen centuries ago. Ilara sank to her knees at the edge of the clearing, the cold of the earth seeping through her trousers. Tears she did not know she had been holding back streamed down her face, hot against her chilled skin. This was not a haunting to be documented and analyzed. It was a wound in the world, a raw, bleeding injustice that time had failed to heal. She felt their terror as a physical weight on her chest, their helplessness a mirror to her own growing sense of powerlessness against the vast, cruel machinery of the past. The phantom flames danced on, and the whispers for mercy, forever unanswered, wove themselves into the fabric of the night, a permanent stain on the soul of the new forest, and a testament to a history written not by the victors, but by the silenced. The mountains of Glencoe did not simply stand, they brooded. They were great, dark sentinels of rock and heather, their shoulders draped in scarves of mist, their faces carved by time and tragedy into expressions of perpetual sorrow. Ilara felt the weight of the place the moment she stepped from her car, a profound atmospheric pressure that had nothing to do with the weather and everything to do with memory. The air itself was thick with it, a chilling damp that carried the scent of wet stone and peat, and something else, the faint metallic tang of old blood. This was a valley of betrayal, and the land had never forgiven the trespass. She walked along the winding road that cut through the glen, the towering peaks of the Three Sisters looming over her, their summits lost in a shroud of low grey cloud. A burn, swollen with recent rain, tumbled and frothed alongside the path, its cheerful gurgle a stark contrast to the somber mood of the landscape. But beneath the sound of the water, Ilara began to hear other things. It started as a whisper on the wind, a faint collective cry that seemed to rise from the very bedrock. It was the sound of panic, of shattered trust, a ghostly echo of the chaos that had erupted here on a snowy morning in 1692. Then, weaving through the lament, came the distant, mournful skirl of bagpipes, not a rousing battle anthem, but a pibroch, a lament for the dead, its notes twisting and falling like the sighs of the slain. The wind picked up, moaning through the narrow passes, and the mist that clung to the high corries began to descend, spilling down the mountainsides in silent grey waterfalls. It flowed across the valley floor, softening the edges of the world, muting the colours of the heather to a dull purple grey. Visibility dropped to a few dozen yards, transforming the grand, epic landscape into something intimate and haunted. Ilara pulled her coat tighter, the cold seeping deep into her bones. She was no longer just a visitor observing a historical site. She was a participant in its enduring grief. It was then that he appeared. A figure stepped from the wall of mist ahead, his form coalescing. From the vapour, like a thought given substance. He was a Highlander, tall and broad-shouldered, clad in the phantom plaid of his clan, the tartan muted and indistinct. A fine drizzle seemed to pass through him, and where his feet should have touched the ground, there was only the swirling mist. He did not look at her, but stood with his profile to her, his head bowed as if in prayer or profound weariness. He held a ghostly dirk in his belt, and his long hair was damp with spectral dew. There was no menace in his posture, only a deep, abiding sorrow that radiated from him like cold from ice. He began to walk, gliding soundlessly over the rough terrain, and Ilara, her breath caught in her throat, knew she was meant to follow. He led her away from the road, up a steep, rocky incline where the mist was thickest. The distant cries and the lament of the pipes grew louder, a symphony of anguish that seemed to guide their path. The climb was arduous, her boots slipping on wet stone, but the misty clansman remained always just ahead, a constant, beckoning silhouette in the gloom. He was not a guide of flesh and blood, but a memory, a piece of the valley's soul leading her to its broken heart. They reached a small, secluded hollow, sheltered by a weeping outcrop of rock. The ground here was uneven, marked not by headstones, but by subtle, grass-covered mounds that sank lower than the surrounding earth. It was a burial site, unmarked and forgotten by all but the land itself. The air in the hollow was frigid, so cold it burned her lungs with each breath. The phantom Highlander stopped at the edge of the hollow and finally turned to face her. His features were blurred, but in the mist where his eyes should have been, Elara saw a reflection of the massacre, the flash of steel in the pre-dawn dark, the shock on faces of men who had shared bread with their murderers, the desperate flight of women and children into the snow-blinded hills. He lifted an arm, his gesture encompassing. The entire hollow, a silent testament to the trust shattered, and the lives extinguished not in fair combat, but under the guise of hospitality. The sorrow that washed over Elara was so profound it felt like a physical blow. It was a collective grief, the anguish of a people betrayed by the very laws meant to protect them. The distant cries coalesced into a single silent scream of injustice that seemed to vibrate in the stones beneath her feet. Then, as suddenly as he had appeared, the clansman began to fade. His form dissolved, the mist of his body merging back into the greater fog until there was nothing left but the cold, damp air and the echo of his unspoken plea. Elara stood alone in the burial hollow, the weight of the glen's sorrow pressing down on her. She knelt, placing a hand on one of the soft, sunken mounds. The earth felt charged, humming with the residual pain of the souls interred within it. This was not a haunting of a single ghost, but the haunting of an entire glen, a scar upon the landscape where the very concepts of honor and trust had been murdered. The wind carried the final fading note of the pibroch, and in that moment, Elara understood that some places are not just haunted by their past, they are defined by it, forever echoing with the sound of a betrayal that time could not and would not erase. There is a particular quality to the light in the Trossachs just before it fails, a soft golden haze that gilds the heather-clad hills and turns the lochs to sheets of burnished silver. It is a landscape crafted by poets and painters, a vision of romantic Scotland so perfect it feels almost staged. But Elara had learned that beauty was often the most effective mask for sorrow, and beneath the picturesque surface of Loch Katrine lay a story not of romance, but of love curdled into eternal loss. The legend of the Grey Lady was not one of violent death or historical atrocity, but a quieter, more intimate haunting, a ghost born from a broken heart. So profound it had stained the very water. She arrived at the loch's edge as the sun began its final spectacular descent behind the bristling peaks of Ben Arn. The water was preternaturally still, a perfect mirror for the fire-streaked sky and the dark, brooding shapes of the surrounding hills. A small wooden rowboat was tied to a rickety jetty, its oars resting inside as if awaiting her. The air was cool and clean, scented with pine and damp earth, but as Elara untied the rope and stepped gingerly into the boat, a deeper chill settled over the loch, a stillness that felt less like peace and more like a held breath. Pushing off from the jetty, she took up the oars, the creak of the rowlocks and the soft splash of the blades the only sounds breaking the immense silence. With each pull she glided further from the shore, from the solid, knowable world of trees and soil, and into the realm of reflection and memory. The water was so clear she could see the stony bottom receding into deep indigo darkness. The romantic grandeur of the scenery should have been uplifting, but a profound melancholy wrapped itself around her, as tangible as the evening mist beginning to coil over the water's surface. She was not here for the view, she was here to meet a sorrow that had become one with the landscape. Twilight deepened, bleeding the color from the world, transforming the loch into a monochrome study in silver and shadow. The mountains became stark cutouts against a violet sky, and the first stars pricked the firmament like distant cold diamonds. It was in this liminal hour, between day and night, that she saw her. A figure far out in the center of the loch, where the water was deepest. She was not in a boat, nor was she swimming. She was gliding, a tall, slender form composed of the same silvery mist that now rose from the water, her long grey robes flowing around her like liquid smoke. She moved with a silent, effortless grace, her feet seeming to skim the placid surface without causing a single ripple. Elara stopped rowing, letting the boat drift, her heart a frantic bird trapped in the cage of her ribs. This was the Grey Lady. The ghost made no sound, offered no gesture of threat or welcome. She simply was, a permanent feature of the loch as much as the islands or the surrounding hills. As the spectral figure drew nearer, Elara could make out more details, the pale, ethereal cast of a face that held an expression of infinite sadness, eyes that were dark pools of remembered pain. She did not look at Elara so much as through her, her gaze encompassing the boat, the water, and the hills beyond, as if seeing a different time layered over the present. The Grey Lady passed within 20 feet of the drifting boat, close enough for Elara to feel the temperature plummet, a wave of cold so intense it felt like stepping into a tomb. The ghost's silent gaze finally settled upon Elara, and in that moment a flood of understanding, wordless and profound, passed between them. It was not a story told in images or words, but a raw transmission of emotion, the fierce, consuming joy of a love found in this very landscape, followed by the shattering, absolute desolation of its loss. It was the pain of a promise broken not by malice, but by cruel fate, a separation so final it had severed a soul from its peace. The warning was implicit in the sorrow. This land, for all its beauty, was built upon a foundation of loss. To love it was to bind oneself to its inherent tragedy, to risk a heartbreak so complete it could echo through eternity. Then, as silently as she had appeared, the Grey Lady began to fade. Her misty form dissolved, merging back into the rising vapors of the loch, until there was no distinction between ghost and environment. The intense cold receded, leaving Elara shivering in the boat, the oars cold and heavy in her hands. The encounter had lasted only a minute, but the weight of the ghost's sorrow felt like a lifetime. She had not been menaced, nor had she been shown a vision of violence. She had been entrusted with a feeling, a core sample of a grief so pure and enduring it had become a geological feature of the place. Elara turned the boat, the task feeling Herculean, and began the slow row back to the jetty. The romantic landscape now seemed haunted in a new way, its beauty a poignant, painful reminder of the Grey Lady's warning. Every perfect reflection in the water, every majestic sweep of the hills, spoke of a love that was inseparable from loss, a bond to the land that was both a blessing and the most profound of curses. She tied the boat, her fingers numb, and looked back one last time at the silent silver loch. The ghost was gone, but her message remained, etched into the twilight air, a testament to the fact that some hauntings are not about vengeance, but about a love so powerful that not even death could untether it from the earth it adored. The mountains knew the shape of dragons. This was the truth that settled over Elara as she crossed into the shadow of Snowdonia, a truth whispered by the jagged peaks that clawed at the low, slate-grey sky and echoed in the deep, glacier-carved valleys. After the intimate sorrows of lochs and glens, this landscape felt primal, a realm where myth was not a story told but a force that had sculpted the very rock. The air tasted different here, sharp with cold and the scent of wet stone and high wind-blasted heather. It was a land that demanded reverence, a kingdom where humanity was a fleeting guest and the old powers still held sway. In the small, stone-built village that clung to the mountain's foot, the legends were not hidden in archives, but lived on the tongues of the people. Over a cup of strong, bitter tea in a cafe steamy from the rain, an elderly bookseller with hands like gnarled oak roots spoke not of ghosts, but of a legacy written in fire and scale. He told her of Wydredraig Goch, the red dragon of Wales, a symbol of fierce, untamable spirit. But his voice dropped to a hush when he spoke of a deeper, older tale, one the tourists never heard, the legend of a prince, not of Wales, but of a forgotten celestial line, who had loved a mortal woman and been cursed for his transgression. His punishment was an eternal draconic slumber deep within the heart of the mountain, his dreams of loss and longing sometimes stirring the earth and twisting the paths of those who wandered too close. Armed with this new, tantalizing thread, Ilara chose a trail that led away from the popular routes, a rugged path that switched back steeply up a sheer-sided valley. The going was tough, the path little more than a sheep track in places, littered with loose scree that skittered away under her boots. The grandeur was immense, the scale humbling. Waterfalls, swollen from the perpetual drizzle, cascaded in white ribbons down black rock faces, their thunder a constant roaring companion. But as she climbed higher, the familiar, uncanny sensations began to prickle at her senses. The animal behavior was the first sign. A flock of ravens, usually so bold and cacophonous, fell utterly silent as she passed beneath their perch on a craggy outcrop, their black, intelligent eyes tracking her progress with an unnerving stillness. A few miles further, a herd of wild mountain goats, normally skittish, stood their ground on a precarious ledge above her, their bearded faces turned down toward her, not with curiosity, but with a kind of ancient, knowing judgment. It was as if the very wildlife were sentinels for the mountain's secret heart. Then came the cold spots. They were not the gradual chill of altitude, but sudden, shocking pockets of frigid air that she would walk into without warning. One moment she was warmed from the exertion of the climb, the next she was shivering, her breath pluming in an air that felt 20 degrees colder, a deep, bone-aching cold that had no source, and vanished the moment she took another step forward. These spots felt dead, void of the mountain's wild energy, as if she were passing through a bubble of absolute stillness and negation. As the short grey day began to fail, the light leaching from the sky, she found a small, relatively flat shelf of land overlooking the vast U-shaped valley she had ascended. It was sheltered by a towering wall of rock on one side and offered a breathtaking, terrifying view of the darkening wilderness on the other. The sense of impending discovery was a physical pressure in her chest, a certainty that she was on the threshold of something vast and ancient. This was no mere haunting. It felt like approaching the lair of a sleeping god. With practiced, weary movements, she set up her camp. The hiss of her stove and the small, defiant circle of light from her headlamp were meager defenses against the encroaching vastness of the mountain night. The wind, which had been a constant moan, fell silent, and in the profound quiet, she could almost feel the weight of the slumbering prince, the restless dreams of the cursed dragon stirring in the deep places beneath her feet. Dusk settled over Snowdonia like a blanket, and as the first stars pricked the clear, cold sky above the peaks, Ilara sat wrapped in her sleeping bag, watching the darkness gather in the valley below, knowing that the mountain was merely holding its breath, waiting for the true night to reveal its secrets. The storm did not announce itself with a gradual build, but fell upon the mountain in a single furious instant. One moment, there was only the profound silence of the high peaks and the cold glitter of stars. The next, a shrieking wind slammed into Ilara's tent, snapping the nylon taut and threatening to tear the pegs from the thin soil. Thunder, not a distant rumble but an immediate concussive blast, shook the very rock beneath her. Then the rain came, a horizontal deluge that hammered against the fragile shelter with the force of thrown stones. Inside, Ilara huddled. In her sleeping bag, the world reduced to a cacophony of roaring wind, drumming rain, and the violent flapping of fabric. It was chaos, a raw elemental fury that seemed intent on scouring her from the mountainside. And then, through the maelstrom, she saw the lights. They were not lightning. They appeared in the roiling clouds directly above the valley, great pulsating orbs of crimson and gold that swelled and dimmed in a slow, rhythmic cadence, like the heartbeat of some colossal, unseen beast. They moved not with the wind but against it, weaving through the storm clouds in a complex, deliberate dance. Their light was not the sharp flash of electricity, but a deep internal luminescence that cast no illumination on the landscape below, instead seeming to absorb the darkness around them. They were silent, a terrifying counterpoint to the storm's roar, their pulsating glow speaking of a power that was ancient and utterly alien to the earthly tempest. As Ilara stared, transfixed with a terror that was laced with a strange, burgeoning awe, A new sound tore through the night. It was not the crack of thunder or the shriek of the wind. It was a roar, a deep, guttural, earth-shaking bellow that seemed to originate from the very core of the mountain beneath her. It was a sound of immense scale and profound sorrow, a cry of longing and fury that vibrated through the rock and up through the soles of her boots. It was the sound from the bookseller's story, the roar of the cursed, dreaming prince. It was the sound of a dragon. The roar echoed, mingling with the thunder, and the lights in the sky pulsed in frantic response, their colors shifting to an agitated, violent violet. The connection was undeniable, instantaneous. The celestial and the terrestrial were not separate here. They were linked, two halves of a single tormented entity. Driven by a compulsion that overrode her fear, Ilara scrambled for her headlamp, pulled on her sodden coat, and unzipped the tent door. The wind immediately tried to tear it from her hands. She stumbled out into the lashing rain, the beam of her light a frail, darting needle in the overwhelming darkness. She did not know what she was looking for, only that she had to find it. The dragon's roar had seemed to emanate from the rock face sheltering her camp. Pushing against the gale, she moved along its base, her light scanning the wet black stone. The rain blurred her vision, the wind stealing her breath. And then she saw it. Not a natural fissure or a stain of lichen, but a series of deep, deliberate grooves carved into a flat, sheltered section of the rock, protected from the worst of the elements by a jutting overhang. She moved closer, wiping water from her eyes with a trembling hand. The carvings were ancient, weathered to a softness that spoke of millennia, but their forms were still clear. They depicted not dragons or princes, but constellations. Familiar patterns of stars, Orion's belt, the plough, the Pleiades, were etched with precision, but woven between them, connecting star to star in lines of furious energy, was the unmistakable serpentine form of a great dragon. Its body was the Milky Way, its claws were comets, its eye a single deeply drilled point that aligned with the pole star. And at the center of the carving, where the dragon's heart would be, was a human figure, arms outstretched. Not in sacrifice, but in a gesture of union. Ilara's breath caught. Her mind, a repository of a dozen different hauntings, suddenly spun a thread that connected them all. The hanged man in Sherwood, appearing under a hunter's moon. The phantom flames of the New Forest, said to burn brightest during meteor showers. The soot-covered child in the Forest of Dean, leading her to a sealed shaft on the anniversary of a mine collapse that coincided with a lunar eclipse. The temporal disorientation in Cannock, chase under impossible geometric lights. It was not random. It was never random. The hauntings were not merely echoes of trauma. They were events amplified, triggered, perhaps even created by celestial alignments, the energy of passing comets, the gravitational pull of certain planetary conjunctions, the charged particles of a solar storm. These were the keys that unlocked the doors between worlds, that gave shape and voice to the sorrow trapped in the land. The forests were not just haunted by their past, they were resonators, tuned to the frequencies of the cosmos. The dragon of Snowdonia was not a myth sleeping in the mountain. It was a cosmic force, a manifestation of celestial power bound to the earth by a prince's tragic love, its restlessness and its roars echoing through the ley lines, stirring all the other ghosts she had encountered on her journey. She was not just a chronicler of local legends. She was a witness to a symphony of sorrow played on a scale as vast as the universe itself, with the earth itself as the instrument and the stars as the conductors. Some roads are not meant to be walked, but witnessed. They exist not as mere routes from one place to another, but as living architecture, their purpose so imbued with story that the very air seems to curdle with intent. The Brega Road in County Antrim was such a place, known the world over as the Dark Hedges. It was an avenue not of pavement and street lamps, but of ancient interlocking beech trees, their gnarled and twisted branches weaving a tangled Gothic archway over the narrow winding lane. They stood like the petrified ribs of some colossal slumbering beast, a natural cathedral built not for worship, but for the quiet, patient hosting of a singular, sorrowful ghost. Ilara arrived in the late afternoon. the low sun casting long, distorted shadows that stretched like grasping fingers across the tarmac. The silence was immediate and profound, a heavy blanket that smothered the distant hum of the modern world. Stepping from her car felt like crossing a threshold into another realm. The air was cooler here, carrying the damp, earthy scent of moss and decaying leaves. She walked slowly down the center of the lane, her neck craned back to take in the impossible, beautiful strangeness of it all. The branches, thick as a man's thigh and draped in a shroud of vibrant green moss, formed a tunnel so complete it felt like walking through the veins of the earth itself. Sunlight filtered through the dense canopy in scattered golden shafts, illuminating swirling motes of dust and highlighting the deep, rugged textures of the bark. She had come for the story of the Grey Lady, a phantom said to be a maid from a nearby estate who had met a tragic end centuries ago. The tale, as told by the few locals who would speak of it, was one of clandestine love and a broken promise. The maid, waiting for her lover in this very lane, had died of exposure one bitter night, her faith unshaken even as the cold claimed her. Now, her restless spirit was said to wander the avenue after dark, forever searching for the one who never came, her presence heralded by a sudden, inexplicable chill and the faint echoing sound of a young woman's laughter. Seeking a more tangible connection to the legend, Ilara had arranged to meet a local photographer, a man named Ronan, whose portfolio contained a series of hauntingly beautiful images of the hedges. She found him at a small, cluttered studio in a nearby village, a man in his 60s with kind eyes and the patient hands of an artist. Over a cup of strong tea, he showed her his work. The photographs were stunning, capturing the lane in every season and light. But it was a specific series, taken on a clear, moonlit night, that held her rapt. In several of the shots, standing between the great rib-like trunks, was a faint, milky smudge, a column of mist that held a vaguely human shape. In one, it seemed to be looking directly at the camera, a pale oval where a face should be. In another, taken a moment later, it had vanished entirely. Ronan called them anomalies, a technical term that did little to mask the awe in his voice. He spoke of the camera growing cold in his hands at the moment of capture, of batteries draining for no reason, and of a feeling of being watched that was so intense he would often pack his equipment and leave before he had the shot he wanted. Thanking him, Ilara returned to the dark hedges as the day began its final surrender. The quality of the light changed, the gold leaching away to be replaced by a cool blue-gray twilight. The long shadows merged, deepening the gloom beneath the archway of trees until it felt like staring into a tunnel of absolute blackness. The lane was deserted now, the last of the daytime visitors having departed. A profound stillness settled, broken only by the rustle of a final stubborn leaf detaching itself and spiraling down to the damp ground. As the last sliver of sun disappeared below the horizon, a change swept through the avenue. It began as a breeze, a gentle sigh that stirred the highest leaves. But then it dropped, plunging down to ground level as a sudden shocking gust of wind that was icy cold, a winter's breath in the heart of the mild evening. It whipped down the lane, plucking at Ilara's coat and tangling her hair, carrying with it the scent of frost and forgotten things. And on that chilling gust, faint and far away at first, then seeming to swirl around her from all directions, came the sound. It was the ghost of laughter, a young woman's bright, melodic giggle, but distorted, stretched thin by time and sorrow. It held no joy, only the hollow echo of a happiness remembered but forever out of reach. The sound seemed to dance between the trees, now behind her, now ahead, now whispering directly into her ear, before fading back into the encroaching darkness. Ilara stood frozen, the photographer's anomalies burning in her mind, the theoretical ghost now a chilling, audible reality in the deepening twilight of the hedges. The stage was set, and the audience of ancient trees waited in silent anticipation for the night's main performer to take her place. The full moon rose like a polished silver coin, its cold, unforgiving light filtering through the tangled lattice of branches to cast a mosaic of stark shadows and spectral illumination upon the lane. The world was rendered in monochrome, every gnarled twist of bark and every undulation of the road thrown into sharp, dramatic relief. The playful, chilling breeze and the ghostly laughter had ceased, leaving a silence so profound it felt like the forest was holding its breath. Elara stood motionless, her own breath pluming in the sudden deep cold that had descended, her senses stretched to their limit. She was no longer an observer, she was a component in a ritual as old as the trees themselves. Then, between two of the largest, most twisted beeches, the air began to shimmer. It was not a trick of the light, but a coalescing of the moonlight itself, drawing the silver radiance from the air and weaving it into a form. A tall, slender figure slowly materialized, her substance composed of the same luminous mist that now rose from the damp earth. She was the maid. Her gown, a simple, high-waisted shift from a bygone era, flowed around her in ethereal tatters, and her hair cascaded over her shoulders like a waterfall of spun moonlight. Her features were soft, blurred at the edges, but the expression of profound sorrow etched upon her face was unmistakable. She did not walk so much as drift, her feet floating inches above the tarmac, her progress a silent, graceful glide that carried her from one pool of shadow to the next. Elara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic living drum in the dead silence. She fumbled in her coat pocket, her fingers numb with cold and adrenaline, and pulled out her small, leather-bound notebook and a pen. Her hands trembled so violently she could barely hold them steady. This was no fleeting glimpse, no anomalous smudge on a photograph. This was a sustained, conscious presence. The spirit moved with a purpose, her head turning slowly as if scanning the lane, her gaze, a weight Elara could feel from 20 paces, forever searching for a face that would never appear. As the phantom drifted closer, the ancient beech trees surrounding her began to stir. It was not the wind, for the air was perfectly still. The leaves, dry and brittle from the autumn chill, began to rustle. It started as a soft, susurrating whisper, a sound like distant waves on a shingle beach. But as the maid drew level with Elara, the rustling intensified, forming into patterns, into rhythms. It was no longer a random sound of nature, but a voice. The leaves, thousands upon thousands of them, became her vocal cords, their collective rustle shaping words from the air itself, a story woven from sound and sorrow. The tale they told was not one of violence or betrayal, but of a love so pure its denial had created a prison of the soul. The rustling leaves whispered of stolen moments in this very lane, of secret vows exchanged under the sheltering boughs, of a promise of elopement made by a young man of means to a lowly maid. They spoke of her unwavering faith, of her nightly vigils in the cold, her heart a burning ember of hope against the gathering frost. The leaves trembled with the memory of her growing desperation, then fell into a hush that was more terrible than any sound as they conveyed the final crushing truth: he never came. A more advantageous match had been arranged. The promise was broken. The cold did not kill her, it was merely the instrument. The true cause was a heart shattered by the weight of a love given completely and returned with nothing but silence. The spirit paused in her drifting, turning her pale, luminous face toward Elara. In that moment, a flood of emotion, not images or words, but the raw, undiluted essence of her story, washed over the researcher. It was the exquisite agony of hope, the piercing cold of abandonment, the eternal, gnawing question of why. This was the bond that held her here. It was not vengeance that anchored her to the lane, but the unyielding power of her unrequited love, a force so potent it had transcended death itself. She was not haunting the dark hedges, she was forever waiting within them, a monument to a promise that defined her existence more than her life ever had. Tears streamed down Elara's frozen cheeks, freezing tracks of empathy and shared grief. Her trembling hand moved across the page of her notebook, the pen scratching frantically, a desperate attempt to capture the impossible, to translate the language of rustling leaves and spectral sorrow into ink and paper. She wrote not just the facts of the story, but the feeling of it, the crushing weight of a devotion that had become a curse. She documented the way the moonlight seemed to weep through the branches, the way the very air ached with the maid's longing. As the moon began its slow descent, the apparition started to fade. Her form grew translucent, the silver mist of her body dissipating like breath on a cold mirror. The rustling of the leaves softened, the whispered story fading back into an ordinary natural sound. With one last lingering look down the empty, moon-washed lane, the grey lady dissolved, her essence returning to the silence from which it had come. The deep cold lifted, and the ordinary sounds of the night, a distant owl, the scuttle of a hedgehog, tentatively returned. Ilara stood alone, her notebook clutched to her chest. The page was filled with her rushed, jagged script, a permanent record of a temporary, profound connection. She looked down the avenue, at the archway of trees that now seemed less like a monster's ribs and more like the bars of a beautiful eternal prison. The haunting of the dark hedges was a tragedy of the heart, a reminder that the most powerful ghosts are not born from hatred, but from a love that refused to die. Royalty leaves a different kind of ghost, one woven not from peasant sorrow or outlaw vengeance, but from the heavy, velvet-draped threads of power and privilege. Savernake Forest felt the moment Ilara crossed its boundary, the air shifting from the common chill of the English countryside to a deeper, more resonant cold, one that spoke of crowned heads and the silent, desperate intrigues of the court. This was no wild wood. It was a former royal hunting ground, its grand oaks and sweeping beech avenues laid out with a geometric precision that felt both magnificent and oppressive. The very trees seemed to stand at attention, ancient sentinels guarding the secrets of kings who had ridden here for sport, their pleasure paid for in the blood of stags and the silenced whispers of courtiers. Ilara moved along the grand avenue, a breathtaking corridor of trees that stretched for miles in a dead straight line, a testament to the absolute power that could command nature itself into such orderly submission. Sunlight, filtered through the dense summer canopy, dappled the grassy ride, but the light felt old, gilded, as if shining through a pane of antique glass. Her map, a photocopy from a local history society journal, was marked with a single circled location deep in the older, less managed part of the forest, the King's Oak. It was not the largest tree in Savernake, but it was reputedly the most haunted, a gnarled, lightning-scarred veteran said to be a favoured resting spot for the ghost of the forest's most infamous royal hunter, the bloated, mercurial spectre of King Henry VIII. The path narrowed, the formal geometry of the avenue giving way to a more primal woodland of thick holly, twisted hawthorn, and ancient oaks whose limbs were heavy with moss and memory. The air grew still and close, the sounds of the modern world fading to nothing. Following the map's faded lines, she pushed through a thicket of ferns and emerged into a small, shadow-dappled clearing. And there it stood, the King's Oak. It was a monster of a tree, its trunk vast and fissured, a great blackened scar running down one side where lightning had struck it centuries ago. One massive, low-sweeping branch, wide enough to lie upon, reached out over the clearing like a throne for a giant. The ground around its roots was bare, as if the earth itself refused to grow anything that might challenge its dominion. As she was examining the tree, sketching its formidable shape into her notebook, a figure emerged from the woods on the other side of the clearing. He was an elderly man, dressed in practical tweeds and leaning on a walking stick carved from a single piece of yew. He moved with the slow, considered pace of one who knew every root and stone. He introduced himself as Dr. Armitage, a local historian who had spent a lifetime studying Savernake's past. His eyes, pale and sharp behind wire-rimmed spectacles, held no surprise at finding her there. It was as if he had been expecting her. He joined her by the oak, his voice a low, scholarly murmur that fit perfectly with the forest's hushed atmosphere. He spoke not of dry dates and treaties, but of the king's visceral presence in the forest. He detailed the sightings, which were always the same, not the young, athletic prince, but the older, monstrous king, his vast, padded silhouette astride a phantom steed, his face a bloated mask of pain and fury. The ghost was not seen hunting, but wandering, lost, as if searching for something he could no longer name, a moment of grace, a lost wife, his own squandered health. Dr. Armitage described the sound that often accompanied the apparition, a labored, wheezing breath, the jingle of rich harness, and the phantom baying of hounds that had long since turned to dust. The king, he explained, was not haunting the forest he had loved. He was trapped within the memory of his own decaying power, a prisoner of the very domain he had once commanded. As twilight began to pool in the clearing, Dr. Armitage tipped his hat and melted back into the trees, leaving Elara alone with the imposing oak and the weight of his stories. The compulsion to stay was too strong to ignore. She retreated to the edge of the clearing, finding a relatively flat, sheltered spot to set up her small tent. The act felt transgressive, like camping in the throne room of a sleeping, temperamental monarch. As she cooked a simple meal on her camp stove, the last of the daylight faded and the forest was plunged into a deep, velvety darkness, broken only by the weak beam of her headlamp. She sat in the opening of her tent, wrapped in a blanket, listening. The ordinary night sounds of the forest felt muted, hesitant. An hour passed, then another. Just as she began to consider sleep, the sound came. It started as a vibration in the earth, a faint, rhythmic thrumming that grew steadily louder. Hoofbeats. Not the light, skittering steps of a deer, but the heavy, deliberate, earth-shaking cadence of a warhorse moving at a canter. They were distant at first, echoing through the trees as if from another time, but they grew closer, circling her clearing, a phantom patrol on an endless midnight round. And then, weaving through the pounding of the hooves, another sound, the clear, mournful note of a hunting horn, a single, sustained blast that was not a call to the chase, but a lament, a signal of something lost. The sounds circled her for what felt like an eternity, a spectral retinue forever bound to their king, their presence a chilling confirmation that in Savernake Forest the past was not dead. It was riding, an endless, ghostly hunt through the corridors of power, forever echoing with the sound of a crown that had become a cage. The phantom hunt did not fade so much as it was absorbed, the thunder of hooves and the cry of the horn sinking back into the soil, until the night was once again a vessel of profound silence. But the silence was different now, charged, expectant, heavy with the imminence of what had passed. Elara remained frozen in her tent's opening, every nerve alight, her ears straining against the quiet. The compulsion to move, to follow the echo of that spectral cavalcade, was a physical pull in her chest. She grabbed her headlamp and stepped out into the clearing, the beam a frail, darting eye in the absolute blackness beneath the trees. The map was useless now. The path she had followed in daylight was swallowed by the night. She moved on instinct alone, drawn away from the king's oak and into a dense thicket of holly and bramble that clawed at her coat and snagged her trousers. The undergrowth was a tangled wall, the thorns sharp and possessive. Within minutes she was utterly lost, the beam of her light showing only a maddening repetition of dark trunks and grasping branches. The forest had closed its fist around her, the geometric order of the Grand Avenue a distant memory. Panic, cold and sharp, began to prickle at the edges of her resolve. She was trapped in a living maze, a prisoner of the king's domain. And then the air grew cold. It was not the gradual chill of the deepening night, but a sudden, aggressive frost that bloomed from a single point ahead of her. The moisture on the leaves of a hawthorn bush crystallized into a delicate, frozen lace. From the heart of this unnatural cold, a shape began to form, pulling substance from the shadows and the very air itself. A horse, massive and black, its eyes burning with a faint crimson ember light, materialized first, its hooves not touching the ground but floating inches above the tangled roots. Upon its back sat the king. He was exactly as Dr. Armitage had described, a vast, padded silhouette, a mountain of velvet and fur. His face was a bloated, pale moon in the darkness, the features coarse and set in a permanent rictus of pain and imperious wrath. A jeweled cap sat askew on his head, and one fleshy hand, shimmering with the translucence of a spectre, held the reins of his phantom steed. The other hand, skeletal and stripped of all but the ghost of flesh, was raised, a single bony finger extended. He did not look at Elara, but past her, through her, his gaze fixed on some point in the distant, impenetrable wood. The finger, a stark white accusation in the gloom, pointed unwavering into the thicket to her left. A terror more profound than any she had yet felt seized her, a dread not of the supernatural, but of the absolute, unquestionable authority this ghost still wielded. This was not a plea or a guide, it was a royal command. Her legs moved of their own volition, pushing her through the thorny barrier in the direction he indicated. The spectral king and his steed remained motionless, a frozen tableau of regal power, as she forced her way past the last clutching branches. The thicket gave way abruptly to a small, hidden glade, a secret chamber in the forest's heart. The moon, finding a rare break in the canopy, poured its silver light onto a circle of soft, mossy ground. And there, in the center of the illuminated patch, lay the relics. They were not grand treasures, but poignant, personal fragments of a world long dead. A tarnished silver locket, its hinge broken, lay half buried in the moss. Next to it was a signet ring, the crest upon it worn almost smooth but still bearing the faint impression of a Tudor rose. And beside the ring, its blade spotted with age but still sharp, was a small, ornate dagger, a misericord, the weapon used to deliver a mercy stroke to a wounded stag, or perhaps, in darker circumstances, to a fallen rival. Alara knelt, her breath catching. She did not need to touch them to feel the history they radiated, a cold, bitter energy that spoke of whispered conspiracies and sudden, violent ends. This was no random collection of lost items. This was a cachet, a message. The locket might have held the portrait of a doomed queen. The ring could have sealed a treasonous letter. The dagger spoke for itself. These were not the echoes of a king's sporting life, but the detritus of his tyranny, the physical evidence of the curse that had clung to his reign, a curse of absolute power that corrupted everything it touched, leaving a trail of broken lives and shattered loyalties. The theme that had been weaving itself through all her journey, the corrupting nature of power and its long, sorrowful echoes, snapped into sharp, painful focus here, in this moonlit glade. The king's ghost was not lost. He was bound here, to this forest he had owned, forced to eternally point toward the evidence of his own damnation, a spectral jailer of his own legacy. The haunting was not about his personal sorrow, but about the indelible stain his power had left upon the land, a curse that reverberated through the centuries, a dark, resonant chord in the symphony of the forest's sorrows. The phantom hoofbeats, the hunting horn, the skeletal finger, they were all part of the same endless repeating cycle, the exercise of power, and the terrible, inescapable price both the powerful and the powerless were doomed to pay. The ghost of war never truly dies, it merely changes its uniform and waits in the trees. Alara felt this truth settle over her like a shroud the moment she stepped into Thetford Forest, a vast plantation of pine and heathland in Norfolk that had once served as a brutal training ground for the soldiers of 2 world wars. The air here was different from the ancient, mystical chill of Savernake, or the intimate sorrow of the dark hedges. It was sharp with the scent of pine resin and damp earth, but beneath it lay a metallic tang, the phantom smell of cordite, sweat and fear that had soaked into the soil and never fully washed away. This was a landscape haunted not by kings or lovelorn maidens, but by the collective, grinding trauma of thousands of young men molded into weapons and then cast into the fire. Her research had led her away from the public footpaths and into the forests. Forgotten heart, where the skeletons of the war effort lay rusting in the bracken. She walked along overgrown tracks, her boots crunching on a carpet of brown needles, the regimented rows of pines standing like silent, green-clad sentries. The silence was the first unnerving quality. It was not a peaceful quiet, but a watchful, heavy stillness, as if the forest itself was listening for a command that would never come. Then, as she moved deeper into an area marked on her old map as an abandoned training ground, the silence began to break. It started as a faint, rhythmic pounding, a vibration felt more through the soles of her boots than heard with her ears. Thump, thump, thump. It was the ghost of a marching column, 100 booted feet hitting the earth in perfect grim unison. The sound grew, layering upon itself until she could almost feel the weight of the phantom soldiers passing by, a spectral parade just out of sight behind the wall of trees. And then came the voices. Not whispers or pleas, but sharp, guttural barks of command, echoing as if from a great distance. "Left, right, left, pick up the pace, you miserable lot." They were not words of malice, but of necessity, the brutal poetry of discipline designed to overwrite fear with instinct. The air grew cold around her, a pocket of remembered winter in the mild day, and she could almost see her breath misting in the presence of these long-vanished drills. Pushing through a thicket of gorse, she stumbled upon the remains of the camp itself, a few crumbling brick foundations, the concrete base of a long-gone Nissen hut, and a single rusted iron bedframe standing stark and lonely amidst the ferns. It was a place of profound desolation, the entropy of nature slowly reclaiming what man had built for a temporary violent purpose. It was here, near the bedframe, that her eye caught a glint of something unnatural. Partially buried under a drift of pine needles and leaf litter was a small metal lockbox, its surface pitted with rust but its latch still intact. Her heart hammered with a mix of trepidation and the fierce thrill of the historian. She pried it open with the blade of her multi-tool, the rusted metal groaning in protest. Inside, protected from the worst of the elements, was a bundle of small leather-bound diaries, their pages brittle and foxed with age. The ink was faded to a watery brown, but the handwriting, a tight, disciplined cursive, was still legible. She sat on a mossy log, the phantom drills a muffled backdrop, and opened the first one. The diaries belonged to a young lieutenant, a man named Edward, who had trained in this very forest in the lead-up to D-Day. His entries were not grand narratives of strategy, but intimate portraits of fear and camaraderie. He wrote of the bone-deep exhaustion of the drills, the taste of fear like a copper penny in his mouth, the black humor that was the only bulwark against despair. But as she read deeper, a more peculiar and unsettling thread emerged. He began to write of temporal disorientation, of seeing figures in period uniforms that didn't match his own, of hearing the crackle of musketry instead of the stutter of Sten guns. He described a night exercise where his entire platoon had become lost, not in space but in time, wandering through a forest that felt ancient and wrong, where the stars in the sky were unfamiliar and the air tasted of wood smoke and old blood. The final, frantic entries spoke of a crack in the world in a part of the forest the men had nicknamed the Mists, a place where past and present bled together. His last words were a terrified scrawl. "We are not the first to be lost here. The forest has taken others. A whole regiment, they say, vanished in the Great War, swallowed by the trees and never seen again. We can hear their drums sometimes, a different beat from ours. I fear we are to join them. We are becoming ghosts before we have even died." Elara lowered the diary, her hands trembling. The phantom drills and shouted commands suddenly took on a new, terrifying dimension. They were not just echoes. They were a warning, a beacon from a regiment lost not to enemy fire, but to the forest itself, a unit trapped in a temporal loop, forever training for a war that had long since ended. Their existence a flickering, eternal prelude to a battle they would never fight. Thetford Forest was not just haunted by the memory of war, it was a prison for its participants, a place where time had become a weapon more terrifying than any bomb or bullet. Midnight in Thetford Forest was a different kind of dark, a suffocating blackness that seemed to swallow light and sound whole. The moon was a sliver of bone behind a scrim of high cloud, offering no comfort, and the regimented pines stood as silent, judgmental witnesses. Elara stood at the edge of the old training ground, the rusted lockbox and its terrifying diaries secured in her pack, their words a cold weight against her spine. The phantom drills had fallen silent, replaced by a waiting stillness that was somehow more menacing. She had come back, drawn by Lieutenant Edward's final, desperate entry to the place he had called the Mists. She needed to see, she needed to know if the forest truly had taken them. The cold began not as a drop in temperature, but as a leaching of warmth from the world itself, a void that started deep within the earth and rose to claim the air. A low-lying fog, thick and opalescent, began to coil up from the damp ground, flowing between the tree trunks like a silent, milky river. It was not natural mist, it moved with a purpose, pooling and swirling in the clearing before her, its touch carrying the scent of ozone and old wool. And then, through the luminous vapor, they appeared. They were translucent, figures woven from memory and moonlight, their forms shimmering with a faint internal phosphorescence. A full company of soldiers, dressed in the uniforms of the Second World War, marched in perfect, ghostly formation through the clearing. Their boots made no sound on the forest floor, their passage silent but for the faint, psychic echo of their collective will. Their faces were blurred, their features lost to time, but their postures were etched with a weary determination, a grim acceptance of a duty that had no end. They were the Lost Regiment, the men from Edward's diary, caught in an eternal rehearsal for a dawn that would never break. Ilara watched, her breath frozen in her lungs, a witness to a tragedy beyond any single death. This was a mass haunting, a soul-deep imprisonment. The column marched past, a river of silent, sorrowful spirits, their eyes fixed on some horizon only they could see. And then, one of them broke rank. A soldier from the middle of the formation turned his head, his shimmering gaze seeming to find hers across the spectral parade. He stepped out of the line, his movement causing no ripple in the perfect discipline of his comrades, who continued their silent march as if he had never been among them. He was younger than the others, his phantom form holding the lanky build of a boy who had barely become a man. He glided toward her, his hand moving to the breast pocket of his tunic. The air around him was so cold it burned, a dry ice that stole the warmth from her face. He stopped an arm's length away, and for a heart-stopping moment, his eyes met hers. In their depths, she saw not the terror of battle, but the profound, weary sorrow of an endless, pointless repetition. He did not speak, he could not. Instead, he extended his hand. Clutched in his translucent fingers was a single piece of paper, folded and refolded until it was a thick, tattered square, its edges soft with age. It was a letter. With a gesture that was both pleading and final, he pressed the spectral paper into her hands. The moment her skin made contact, a jolt of pure, undiluted memory, cold, sharp and saturated with despair, shot up her arm. Then the soldier faded. He did not walk away or dissolve slowly. He simply ceased to be, his form unraveling into strands of mist that were greedily absorbed by the greater fog. The rest of the marching column completed their pass through the clearing and vanished into the trees on the other side, the luminous fog retreating with them, leaving Ilara alone in the sudden, ordinary darkness, clutching a piece of paper that had been given to her by a ghost. Her hands shook violently as she unfolded it. The paper was real, physical, a stark contradiction to the insubstantial form of the soldier who had delivered it. The writing was the same tight, disciplined cursive from the diaries, but the ink was a rusty brown, the color of old blood. It was not a personal letter, not a message to a loved one. It was a warning. The forest does not forget, it began. It absorbs the patterns, the fears, the violence. We drilled here for a war, and the forest learned our drills. Another regiment drilled here before us for their war, and the forest learned theirs too. Now it plays them back, over and over, mixing the times, trapping us all. We are not the first. We will not be the last. The mistake is to believe the past is a separate country. It is not. It is a layer, and in places like this, the layers peel apart. Do not repeat our error. Do not let the forests become archives of our violence. The rage, the fear, the obedience, it seeps into the roots. It becomes a self-sustaining echo. Break the cycle, or you will join the parade. It was signed simply a soldier lost. Ilara sank to her knees, the letter clutched in her numb fingers. The warning was not about a specific battle or a political cause. It was about the very nature of history and the land's terrifying capacity to record human folly. Thetford Forest was a palimpsest of conflict, each war written over the last, until the soil itself had become a resonant chamber for trauma. The ghostly soldiers were not just echoes. They were active participants in a cycle they could not escape, their endless marching a dire prophecy of what could happen if the forest's accumulating sorrow was never quieted. The letter was a plea from the abyss, a message passed from one lost soul to a living one, begging her not to let history's most grievous mistakes, the reliance on violence, the blind obedience, the dehumanizing fear, become a permanent repeating scar upon the world. The weight of it was crushing, a responsibility handed to her at midnight by a boy who had vanished into mist, a single, vital piece of the terrible puzzle she was only just beginning to assemble. The darkness in Kielder was not an absence, but a presence. It was a vast, velvety cloak woven from the void between stars, a profound and absolute blackness that felt less like the end of light and more like the beginning of something else. As an international dark sky park, the forest was a sanctuary for the night, a place where the heavens were allowed to perform their ancient, silent ballet without the interference of earthly glare. Elara stood in a clearing, her head tilted back, her breath pluming in the crisp, cold air, and felt a familiar, scholarly awe curdle into something closer to reverence. The Milky Way was not a smudge here. It was a raging river of diamond dust, a brilliant, swirling scar across the face of the cosmos. Constellations she had only ever seen in textbooks blazed with impossible clarity, each star a pinprick of cold, fierce fire. It was a humbling, magnificent spectacle, a direct line to the infinite. Yet, as the initial wonder subsided, a deeper unease began to prickle at her senses. The magnificence overhead was matched by a profound and unsettling silence on the ground. In every other forest, even in their most haunted corners, there had been the background thrum of life, the scuttle of a beetle, the call of a distant owl, the rustle of a hunting fox. Here, there was nothing. The silence was absolute, a vacuum that seemed to swallow sound before it could be born. It was an eerie void, a stillness so complete it felt artificial, as if the very wildlife had been instructed to hold its breath in the presence of the stellar display. No leaves whispered, no creatures called. The only sound was the frantic living drum of her own heart. Shaking off the disquiet, she turned to her task. She unpacked her equipment with practiced efficiency, the clatter of metal and plastic unnaturally loud in the dead air. She set up her tripod and mounted her high-powered telescope, its lens a single unblinking eye pointed toward the cosmos. Next to it, she arranged her camera, its long exposure settings ready to capture the slow wheeling of the stars. Finally, she activated a sensitive audio recorder, its highly directional microphone aimed at the surrounding trees, a device meant to capture the subtle, sub-audible frequencies that often accompanied paranormal activity. The red lights of the equipment glowed like demonic eyes in the perfect dark, tiny, defiant campfires at the edge of an immense and silent wilderness. It was as she was fine-tuning the focus on her telescope, her body hunched over the eyepiece, that a primal instinct, the old animal sense of being watched, crawled up her spine. She straightened up slowly, her skin prickling. She scanned the tree line, a solid wall of impenetrable shadow at the edge of the clearing. At first she saw nothing but the deeper black of the pines against the star-flecked sky. Then a movement, a subtle shifting of darkness within darkness. A figure stood just inside the perimeter of the forest, tall and unnaturally still, its form a man-shaped cutout of absolute blackness that absorbed the starlight around it. It was simply watching her, a silent sentinel at the edge of her small circle of existence. There was no menace in its posture, no aggression, only a calm, patient observation that was somehow more unnerving than any of the violent phantoms she had encountered. She did not reach for her camera. She knew it would capture nothing. This was not a ghost in the traditional sense. It felt older, more integral to the place. Retreating to the relative safety of her equipment's glow, she pulled out her tablet, its screen a shocking rectangle of blue-white light. She delved into the local digital archives, searching for a myth that would fit this silent stellar watcher. She found it not in tales of kings or murdered lovers, but in older, more ecological folklore. The people of the borders spoke sparingly of a guardian, an entity known as the Watcher in the Wood or the Silent Warden. It was not a human spirit, but a manifestation of the forest itself, a primordial consciousness born from the ancient pines and the dark, peaty soil. Its purpose was not to haunt, but to protect. It was said to appear only when the balance of the forest was threatened, or when a presence disturbed the profound quiet necessary for the land to commune with the stars. It was a myth of stewardship, not sorrow, a guardian of the delicate equilibrium between the earthly and the celestial. And as Ilara read, the feeling of being watched never wavered, a constant silent pressure from the tree line, a reminder that in Kielder, the greatest mysteries were not in the sky above, but in the dark, watching woods below. The figure did not approach with the menace of a predator or the sorrowful drift of a ghost. It simply was, and then it was closer. Its movement not a traversal of space, but a subtle reordering of the darkness around it. One moment it had been a silhouette at the tree line, the next it stood at the halfway point between the forest edge and Ilara's circle of equipment, its presence now an undeniable physical pressure in the clearing. The starlight, so brilliant overhead, seemed to shy away from its form, which remained a tall, shadowy outline, a humanoid shape carved from the absolute black of a cave's deepest chamber, and within the shadow of its head 2 points of light ignited. They were not the crimson embers of a hellhound or the pale glow of a spectre, but a soft, steady, bioluminescent green, the color of deep forest moss or the tranquil pulse of a distant nebula. They were eyes, but they held no pupil, no white, only that calm, observing luminescence. A primal fear, the instinct to flee from the unknown, screamed through Ilara's veins. Her muscles tensed, ready to run, but she held her ground, forcing herself to breathe, to truly look. The fear did not evaporate, but it was joined by a dawning, staggering realization. There was no hostility in its posture, no aggression in its silent vigil. The intense watchfulness she felt was not the gaze of a hunter sizing up prey, but that of a custodian assessing a new element in its domain. The stories of the silent warden flooded back to her. This was not a ghost bound by human tragedy. It was something else entirely, the forest's own soul made manifest. It was protective. As this understanding settled over her, a profound weariness suddenly weighted her limbs. The countless miles, the accumulated sorrows of a dozen haunted woods, the terror and the empathy all crashed down upon her at once. Her knees buckled, and she sank to the cool, damp grass, her head swimming. The glowing green eyes of the watcher held her gaze, and their light seemed to swell, filling her vision until the starfield above and the dark trees around her blurred and melted away. She was falling, not through space, but through layers of consciousness, slipping into a dream state that was more real than waking. A vision unfolded behind her eyes, vivid and immersive. She saw the world not as a collection of separate forests, but as a single, living, breathing organism. Great pulsing ley lines of silver energy connected Epping to Sherwood, the Trossachs to Snowdonia, Thetford to Kielder, a luminous nervous system spanning the entire land. And she saw humanity not as a separate entity, but as a part of this organism, a vibrant, chaotic, sometimes destructive thread woven into the whole. The vision showed her the moments of rupture, the hanged man's final jerk, the witch's cry, the miner's last breath, the soldier's blind obedience. Each trauma was a wound, a spike of black energy that disrupted the silver flow, creating a scar that festered and echoed. Then the vision shifted. She saw ancient people, not druids in the romantic sense, but men and women who understood this connection. They gathered at crossroads of the silver lines, at stone circles and sacred groves. They did not perform sacrifices or chant to gods. They performed rituals of balance. They stood as conduits, their own focused intent and deep reverence acting as a salve. When a great injustice occurred, they did not seek vengeance. They gathered to absorb the shockwave of pain, to transmute the black energy of trauma back into the silver flow of life, singing the land back into harmony. They were the keepers of the equilibrium, the healers of the rift between nature and humanity. The rituals were not about power, but about responsibility, a sacred duty to maintain the dialogue between the earth and those who walked upon it. The knowledge flooded into her, not as words, but as innate understanding. She saw the specific gestures, the mental states of focused calm, the way to stand upon a ley line node and open oneself to the land's pain, not to be consumed by it, but to help carry and disperse its weight. It was an act of profound empathy, a willing sharing of the burden. The purpose was not to erase the past, but to integrate it peacefully, to allow the memory to exist without the corrosive echo. It was the opposite of the cycle she had witnessed in Thetford. It was a way to break it. The vision faded as gently as it had arrived. The brilliant starfield swam back into focus above her. She was still on her knees in the clearing, the cold night air sharp in her lungs. The watcher in the woods still stood before her, its glowing green eyes fixed upon her. But now their light seemed to hold a question, a silent offering. It had not given her a weapon or a map to a treasure. It had given her a purpose, a methodology. The ancient rituals for balancing nature and humanity were not lost. They were here, entrusted to her in a language of pure consciousness. The figure gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of acknowledgement that passed between them like a sigh on the wind. Then it stepped backward, its form dissolving, not into mist, but into the ordinary star-dusted shadows of the pines, leaving Elara alone with the immense silent darkness and the staggering beautiful weight of the knowledge she now carried. The legends of the British forests were a tapestry woven from many threads, the silken sorrow of lost love, the coarse hemp of the hangman's rope, the cold iron of royal command. But in the remote rolling hills of Galloway, Elara felt the presence of a different kind of thread altogether, one spun from pure primal fear. This was not a history haunted by the ghosts of men, but a wilderness haunted by the idea of a beast, a creature that belonged not to folklore's curated pages, but to the shadowy instinctual places of the mind. The air here tasted of peat and cold water, and the vast empty skies seemed to press down upon the land with a weight that silenced all but the most essential sounds. She made her camp in a small, sheltered valley beside a tumbling burn, the gurgle of its water the only companion in the immense quiet. The hills rose around her, great humpbacked giants clad in heather and tough grass, their summits lost in a low, shifting ceiling of cloud. It was a landscape that felt ancient and unfinished, a place where the rules of the modern world held little sway. In the village pub the previous evening, the talk had been sparse and practical, of sheep and weather, until she had mentioned the local legends. Then, a guarded silence had fallen, broken only when an old shepherd named Dougal, his face a roadmap of wind and years, had gestured for her to join him in a corner booth. His voice was a low rumble, like stones shifting in a riverbed. He didn't speak of ghosts or ghouls, but of practical, unsettling facts. He described finding sheep on the high pastures, not taken by foxes or dogs, but killed with a brutal, overwhelming force, their bodies broken in ways that defied the local predators. There were no tracks, no spoor, nothing to explain the violence beyond a few deep, inexplicable gouges in the turf. He spoke of a heavy, musky odor that sometimes hung in the still air of the glens, a scent that set his dogs whining and backing into his legs. He called it the Galloway Beast, but it was clear from his tone that this was not a name born of superstition, but a label for a tangible, unexplained presence. It was a thing of muscle and hunger that left no trace, a paradox of the hills that stalked the border between reality and nightmare. As night fell over her secluded camp, the gurgle of the burn seemed to grow louder, the only anchor in a sea of encroaching darkness. The clouds had thickened, blotting out the stars, and the blackness was absolute, a suffocating blanket that felt both empty and watchful. She sat by her small, dying fire, the orange glow a defiant but pitifully small rebellion against the immensity of the dark. Dougal's words echoed in her mind, painting pictures of silent, powerful things moving through the heather. It was then that she heard it, a single heavy crunch on the stony ground beyond the ring of firelight. It was not the light, skittering step of a fox or the delicate hoof-fall of a deer. It was the sound of immense weight being placed with deliberate care. Her blood ran cold. She sat perfectly still, her ears straining against the thrum of her own pulse. The sound did not repeat. For long minutes there was only the burn, and the crackle of her fire. Then, another crunch, this time to her left, closer. It was followed by a soft tearing sound as something heavy moved through a patch of tough heather. A low, rhythmic puffing reached her, the sound of deep, controlled breathing from a large set of lungs. The footsteps began again, slow, deliberate and heavy, forming a wide, cautious circle around her tent and her dying fire. Crunch, pause, swish of heather, puff of breath. They were pacing her, this unseen presence, its circuit just beyond the reach of the fire's dying light. She could feel its gaze, a physical pressure in the dark, a predatory curiosity that stripped away all the intellectual comfort of her research and left only the raw, trembling animal beneath. The legends of Galloway were not stories. They were a warning written in the soil, and now, in the heavy, circling footsteps in the dark, that warning was being read aloud to her in a language older than words. The heavy, rhythmic breathing just beyond the thin nylon wall was a sound from the world's dawn, a guttural puff and draw that spoke of lungs larger than her own torso, of a heart that beat with the slow, patient rhythm of the ancient hills themselves. Elara lay frozen in her sleeping bag, every muscle locked in a rigor of primal terror. The creature was no longer circling, it had stopped, its immense bulk a palpable darkness pressing against the side of her tent. The fabric of her shelter, which had always felt like a flimsy barrier against the elements, now felt as insubstantial as cobweb. She could smell it, a feral, musky odor of wet earth, dense fur, and something wild and alien, a scent that bypassed thought and screamed directly to the lizard-brain core of her being, predator. Its breath hitched, a low rumble building in its chest that was less a growl and more the sound of tectonic plates shifting deep underground. The sound vibrated through the ground and up through her own body, a subsonic threat that made her teeth ache. She could picture it out there, a massive, indistinct shape blotting out the stars, its head lowered, sniffing at the seam of her tent, deciding. The intellectual curiosity that had driven her through a dozen hauntings was gone, incinerated in the furnace of this base, animal fear. This was not a ghost to be understood or a story to be recorded. This was a presence to be survived. Moving with a slowness born of sheer, gut-wrenching fear, her fingers numb and clumsy, she fumbled for the heavy-duty flashlight she kept by her side. Her hand closed around its cold, rubberized grip. The creature outside shifted its weight, a subtle movement that made the tent poles groan in protest. This was it. Knowledge or death, she had to see. In one frantic, jerking motion, she sat up, unzipped the tent's mesh door a bare few inches, and thrust the flashlight through the gap, thumbing the switch to its most powerful beam. The world outside vanished, swallowed by the blinding white cone of light. For a heart-stopping second, there was nothing. Then, at the very edge of the beam, where the light began to fray into darkness, she saw them. Two eyes. They were set wide apart in a shaggy, shadow-obscured head, and they glowed with a faint, phosphorescent yellow-green, like rotten wood shining in a swamp. They were not the fiery coals of a demon, or the soft luminescence of the Kielder Watcher. These were the eyes of a living, breathing creature, reflecting her light back at her with a cold, ancient intelligence. They held no malice, no curiosity, only a vast, indifferent wildness, the same look a mountain might give a speck of dust on its slope. The eyes blinked once, slowly, the glow vanishing and then reappearing. A low, displeased rumble emanated from the darkness behind them. Then, with a sound like a landslide of heather and stone, the massive shape turned. The pressure against the tent vanished. The heavy, plodding footsteps began again, moving away this time, each. Crunch fainter than the last, the rhythmic puff of its breath fading into the general sigh of the wind over the hills. Within a minute, the night was silent again, save for the frantic hammering of her own heart and the ever-present gurgle of the burn. She did not sleep. She sat huddled in the mouth of her tent, the flashlight clutched in her white-knuckled hand until the first grey light of dawn began to bleed into the eastern sky. As the world slowly took shape around her, she ventured out, her legs trembling, and there they were, just a few feet from her tent. 3 enormous, deep impressions in the soft, peaty soil. They were vaguely paw-shaped, but too large, too splayed, with deep gouges at the front where claws had sunk into the earth. They were the prints of something that should not exist, a testament to the physical reality of the Galloway beast. She took photographs, her hands still shaking, the images feeling both like a triumph and a desecration. But as the sun rose higher, its weak golden light warming the valley, she noticed something impossible. The edges of the prints were softening, the deep impressions slowly filling with water from the damp ground and collapsing in on themselves. By the time the sun had fully cleared the hills, the prints were gone. The peat had simply closed over them, as if the earth itself was complicit in the beast's secrecy, healing the wound its passage had made. There was no evidence left. No track, no spoor, nothing but the memory of glowing eyes and a terror that had felt more real than the ground beneath her feet. The encounter symbolized something far deeper than a mere monster sighting. It was the embodiment of the primal fear that lurked at the heart of all wilderness, the formless dread of the unknown that civilization tries to pave over. The beast was the wild itself, indifferent, powerful, untamable, and ultimately unknowable. It left no trace because it was the trace, the fundamental, haunting truth of the ancient hills. It was the final, wordless proof that some parts of the world refused to be catalogued or understood, existing only in the space between a heavy footfall in the dark and a fading print at dawn, a permanent breathing secret in the heart of the wild. The mountains did not whisper, they pushed. Elara felt it the moment she left the car park and began her ascent into the Brecon beacons, a palpable, physical pressure in the air that was less a welcome and more a testing. It was a different kind of power from the brooding sorrow of Glencoe or the celestial resonance of Snowdonia. This was an older, more mischievous energy, one that seemed to emanate from the very rock underfoot, a playful, territorial spirit that watched her progress with a silent, challenging glee. The path wound steeply upward, through a landscape of sweeping grassy ridges and deep, glacier-carved valleys, the sky a vast open bowl of scudding grey cloud. The wind was a constant buffeting force, plucking at her coat and carrying the clean, sharp scent of wet limestone and high, lonely places. Her destination was a specific waterfall, marked on her map as a place of particular beauty and, according to the fragmentary notes she had gathered, a hotspot for peculiar occurrences. Hikers reported losing their way for no reason, items vanishing from their packs, and a general, unnerving feeling of being herded by unseen hands. As she climbed higher, the feeling intensified. It was not the focused gaze of the Kielder Watcher or the predatory stalk of the Galloway beast. This was something lighter, more capricious. A loose stone would skitter from the path just as she was about to place her foot, forcing her to stumble. A sudden, powerful gust of wind would seem to push directly against her chest, halting her progress for a crucial second. It felt less like a haunting and more like being teased, tested by an invisible, childish hand. She reached the waterfall as the afternoon light began to slant, long and golden, across the valley. It was a spectacular sight, a white ribbon of water cascading over a black cliff face into a deep, peaty pool fringed with shattered rock. The thunder of the fall filled the air, a constant roaring presence. She moved closer, wanting to feel the cool spray on her face, to document the exact location of these strange events. She picked her way carefully across the slick, water-worn stones at the pool's edge, the roar of the water a physical vibration in her chest. As she reached a flat rock near the base of the falls, the push came. It was not the wind, it was a firm, solid pressure in the small of her back, a single, deliberate shove that sent her lurching forward. Her boots slid on the wet stone, and for one heart-stopping moment she was falling toward the churning, ice-cold water. Instinct saved her. She flung her arms out, her fingers scrabbling for purchase on the rough rock, her body slamming hard against a boulder. Pain flared in her ribs, sharp and breathtaking. She clung there, gasping, the roar of the waterfall now sounding like malevolent laughter. She spun around, her heart hammering, but there was nothing behind her but the empty spray-drenched rocks. The push had been utterly real and utterly unseen. Shaken, she retreated to a safer distance, her body trembling with adrenaline and the lingering shock of the fall. That evening, in a climber's hostel nestled in a nearby village, she spread her books and laptop across a small wooden table. The local folklore was rich with tales of the Tylwyth Teg, the Welsh fair folk, but she was drawn to a more specific, more territorial spirit, the Gwyllion. These were mountain fairies, not the benevolent sprites of children's tales, but ancient, often mischievous and sometimes malicious entities who guarded the high places. They were known to lead travelers astray, to create illusions, and to physically harass those who showed disrespect or who wandered into their domains. Uninvited, their tricks were not meant to kill, but to frighten, to assert dominance, to remind humans of their place. The push by the waterfall was a classic Gwyllian tactic, a warning shot across the bow. The next day, nursing her sore ribs, she took a gentler path along a high ridge. The wind had dropped, and the beacons were bathed in soft, hazy sunlight. She met another hiker, a man in his 50s with the lean, weathered look of a seasoned walker, resting on an outcrop and gazing out over the vast panorama. They fell into easy conversation about the routes and the weather, and when Ilara cautiously mentioned the strange feeling around the waterfall, his friendly demeanor shifted. His eyes grew distant, and he told her his own story. He had been an experienced mountaineer, he said, scrambling on one of the more technical ridges in the central beacons a few years prior. The weather had been perfect, the rock dry, but as he traversed a narrow exposed ledge, a hand, ice-cold and utterly solid, had shoved him hard in the back. There was no one there. The push sent him stumbling, his balance gone. He fell, tumbling 20 feet down a scree slope before a lucky outcrop arrested his fall. He was battered, bruised, and had broken his arm, but he had survived. The rescue team found no evidence of rockfall or any other cause. He was certain, he told her, his voice low and earnest, that it had been no accident. It was the mountain itself, or the things that lived on it, telling him he had ventured somewhere he was not welcome. He called them the little people, attributing his near-fatal fall not to his own error, but to the territorial mischief of entities that had been in these hills long before the first footpath was ever carved. His story was not one of grand tragedy, but of a simple, brutal reminder from the ancient guardians of the high places: tread carefully or be pushed aside. The water was not merely falling, it was speaking, the thunderous roar that had filled. Ilara's ears, since her arrival at the waterfall, began to shift, its chaotic white noise resolving into a deeper, more structured rhythm, a percussive beat that vibrated in the marrow of her bones. The fine, cold spray that misted the air seemed to thicken, catching the late afternoon light and refracting it into a million tiny prisms, weaving a curtain of shimmering color between her and the black rock face. The mischievous push she had felt, the territorial warnings of the Gwyllian, all faded into insignificance as a far older, more profound presence announced itself. The capricious spirits of the mountain were merely the outer guardians. She was now being granted an audience with the heart of the mystery itself. The world around the waterfall dissolved. The green of the ferns, the grey of the rock, the white of the tumbling water, all bled away, replaced by a vision of stunning clarity. She was no longer standing on the damp stones of the 21st century, but witnessing a scene from a time when the world was younger and the veil between the earthly and the divine was tissue thin. The waterfall was still there, but the pool at its base was larger, clearer, a sacred well reflecting a sky untouched by industry, and gathered around it were figures, tall and solemn, their forms robed in undyed wool, and their heads crowned with wreaths of oak and mistletoe. They were druids, not the romanticized figures of Victorian paintings, but men and women whose faces were etched with the gravity of their office, their eyes holding the deep, patient knowledge of the turning seasons and the silent language of the stars. They moved in a slow, deliberate circle around the pool, their feet tracing patterns in the moss that seemed to pulse with a faint silver light. In their hands they held not wands or daggers, but simple, rough-hewn bowls from which they poured libations into the water, handfuls of soil, crushed herbs, and what looked like sparkling dust that might have been ground quartz or captured starlight. There was no chant, no spoken invocation. Their ritual was one of pure, focused intent, a silent communion with the spirit of the place. They were not asking for power or favor. They were giving, offering gratitude and receiving wisdom in a timeless exchange. They were tuning the land, aligning its energy with the greater rhythms of the cosmos, acting as living conduits between the soil and the sky. As Ilara watched, transfixed, the vision deepened. She saw beyond the druids, into the very substance of the forests she had traversed. She saw the knowledge they guarded, not scrolls in hidden libraries or golden artifacts buried in barrows, but something far more precious and volatile. It was the living memory of the land itself, a vast psychic archive containing every joy, every sorrow, every act of love and violence that had ever occurred beneath the canopy. It was the raw, unedited history of a people and their home, a tapestry of emotion and experience woven directly into the root systems and the ley lines. This was the forgotten knowledge the spirits had hinted at, the truth that the forests protected. It was the reason for the echoes, the hauntings, the endless repetitions. They were not malfunctions, but the archive's contents bleeding through, demanding to be witnessed, to be integrated, to be understood. The vision shifted, focusing on her. The silent, robed figures turned their heads in unison, their ancient eyes meeting hers across the gulf of centuries. In their gaze, she felt no judgment, only a profound, waiting stillness. They were presenting her with a choice, the same choice they themselves had faced in their time. The knowledge was a responsibility, a power. It could be revealed, shouted from the rooftops, its patterns and secrets laid bare for a world that might exploit it, commercialize it, or worse, simply fail to understand its sacred weight. Or it could be protected, held in trust, its truths shared only with those who approached with the proper reverence, who were willing to listen to the language of rustling leaves and falling water, who understood that some truths are too vast to be contained in a book. The weight of the decision pressed down on her, heavier than any mountain. To reveal it was to risk its corruption, to turn the sacred into the sensational, but to protect it, to keep it secret, was to condemn the ghosts to their endless cycles, to allow the wounds in the land to continue festering, their stories untold and their pain unhealed. She thought of the hanged man in Sherwood, the soot-covered child in the forest of Dean, the lost soldiers in Thetford, all trapped in their moments of trauma, their stories crying out not for vengeance, but for acknowledgement, for a gentle hand to guide their pain back into the great silver river of life. Her role was not to be a simple chronicler. She was being asked to become a keeper, a guardian in the line of those silent druids, to decide whether the forest's most profound secret would be a gift to the world or a trust to be sheltered forever in the quiet, watchful heart of the wild. The roaring of the waterfall returned, the vision fading, but the choice remained, etched into her soul as clearly as the druid symbols were etched into the ancient stone. The laughter of children is a sound that should never be haunted. It is the purest music of life, a bright, chaotic symphony of joy that belongs in sun-dappled parks and grassy back gardens, not echoing through the silent, watchful woods of the Licky Hills. Yet, as Ilara stepped from the bustling car park onto a path that wound into the beach and pine-clad slopes, it was the ghost of that laughter she sought. The local history was not one of kings or battles, but of a quieter, more intimate tragedy, a Victorian-era outing that had ended in calamity, a sudden illness or accident that had claimed the lives of several children from a charitable home. Their story was not grand, enough for the history books, but it had rooted itself in the soil of the Lickies, transforming their playful spirits into permanent, sorrowful residents of the woods they had loved. The air in the Lickies was different from the oppressive wildness of Galloway or the high testing energy of the Beacons. It was a gentle, pastoral landscape of rolling hills and secluded valleys, the paths well trodden by dog walkers and families. Sunlight filtered through the canopy in a soft green-gold light, and the air smelled of warm earth and pine needles. But as Ilara moved away from the main paths, following the vague directions she had gleaned from a century-old newspaper article, the atmosphere began to shift. The cheerful chatter of other walkers faded, replaced by a profound, listening silence. The light seemed to grow older, tinged with a sepia-toned melancholy, as if the hills were remembering a day when the sunshine had been a prelude to grief. She found herself in a small, secluded hollow, sheltered by a ring of ancient beech trees whose smooth grey bark seemed to hold the memory of 1,000 passing seasons. The ground was soft with decades of fallen leaves, and the air was still and cool. It was a place that felt set apart, a perfect secret playground frozen in time. Her research had suggested this was near the spot where the tragedy had unfolded. She moved slowly, her eyes scanning the ground, the ferns, the gnarled roots breaking through the soil, looking for nothing and everything at once. And then she saw it. Tucked into a niche between the sprawling roots of the largest beech tree, half buried in leaf litter and moss, was a doll. It was a pitiful thing, its porcelain face weathered and cracked, one blue glass eye missing, the other staring out with a blank eternal sadness. Its once fine dress was now a rag of faded calico stained with earth and time. It was a relic of a specific lost childhood, a toy that had been clutched by small, loving hands before, being dropped or left behind on a day that had turned from joy to nightmare. The sight of it, this poignant, forgotten artifact, struck a chord deep within Elara, a pang of a maternal instinct she rarely had time to acknowledge, a profound sorrow for a life cut cruelly short. She knelt, her fingers hovering just above the cracked porcelain of its cheek, not daring to touch it, as if the act might shatter the fragile memory it represented. The hollow was utterly silent, the air growing colder around her, the warmth of the day retreating as if in respect for the sorrow of this place. And then she felt it. A touch, a small, impossibly cold hand brushed against the back of her own, its fingers faint and insubstantial as a breath of winter air. The contact was fleeting, a ghost of a caress, but it was unmistakable. It was not a push or a shove, but a gesture of connection, a lonely, childlike reach from across the void. The cold shot up her arm, a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature and everything to do with the absolute, heartbreaking finality of death. It stirred in her a wave of protective, helpless grief, a desire to gather this lost little soul to her and offer a comfort that was centuries too late. The sorrow she felt was no longer academic. It was a raw, physical ache in her chest, a shared moment of loss in a sun-dappled hollow where a broken doll kept watch and a cold, small hand reached out, forever seeking the warmth of the living. Twilight in the Lickies was a gentle thief, stealing the color from the world with a soft, lingering touch. The green of the leaves deepened to emerald, then to black, and the sky above the beech canopy faded from a bruised violet to the color of a deep, still pond. The silence in the hollow, which had been profound before, now became absolute, a held breath, waiting to be released. Elara remained kneeling by the roots of the great beech, the memory of the small, cold hand imprinted on her skin like a brand. The maternal sorrow that had gripped her hardened into a fierce, protective resolve. They were here. The lost children were close, and they were waiting to be seen. As the last of the daylight bled away, the air in the hollow began to shimmer. It started at the edges of her vision, a faint golden luminescence that danced between the tree trunks like will-o'-the-wisps. Then the figures began to form. They were children, 6 or 7 of them, their forms woven from the very substance of the twilight, their bodies glowing with a soft internal light. They were not the sorrowful phantoms of her expectation, but vibrant, energetic spirits caught in the moment of their last, perfect happiness. They materialized in the center of the hollow, their laughter breaking the silence, a sound as clear and bright as bell chimes, a cascade of pure, unadulterated joy that echoed through the trees. They chased each other in a wild, looping game of tag, their glowing feet seeming to barely touch the mossy ground. One little girl, her hair in long, ethereal plaits, spun in circles with her arms outstretched, her head thrown back in delight. A small boy tumbled in a cartwheel of light, his laughter the loudest of all. For a few breathtaking moments, the hollow was alive again with the ghost of a Victorian picnic, a scene of perfect, innocent merriment preserved in amber. But the joy was a facade, a memory playing on a loop. As Elara watched, her heart aching with the beauty and the tragedy of it, the laughter began to change. The bright, chiming sounds fractured, twisting into something else. The carefree game of tag became a frantic, confused running. The spinning girl stumbled and fell, her joyous expression dissolving into one of fear and confusion. The boy's triumphant laughter choked off into a sob. The golden light that composed their forms flickered, dimming to a sickly, jaundiced yellow. The scene of play dissolved into one of sudden, terrifying illness. The children clutched their stomachs, their glowing faces contorted in pain. Their happy shouts became weak, bewildered cries for their mothers, for help, for a comfort that had never arrived in time. The luminous tears that streamed down their cheeks were the most heartbreaking sight of all. Drops of solidified light falling to the dark forest floor and vanishing. The spectral tragedy reached its peak, and then, as one, the children stopped their frantic movements. Their tear-streaked faces turned toward Ilara, their eyes wide with a sorrow that spanned centuries, locking onto hers. The last vestiges of their golden light faded, and they became faint, silvery outlines, little more than sketches of grief on the dark air. They did not speak, but as a single silent entity, they turned and began to drift away from the clearing, moving as if pulled by an invisible thread. They were leading her. Ilara followed, her own tears cold on her face, her footsteps silent on the soft earth. The small, silvery procession glided through the trees, their path taking them deeper into a part of the hills untouched by the main trails, a place of thick bracken and ancient stumbling stone walls. The air grew colder with every step, a deep grave cold that seeped into her bones. They led her to a small, almost invisible depression in the land, hidden behind a curtain of ivy that cascaded down a mossy bank. Parting the ivy with a trembling hand, Ilara saw it. Not a headstone, for there was none, but a subtle sunken patch of earth, smaller than an adult's grave, yet unmistakable in its purpose. It was a hidden, unconsecrated grave, a secret resting place for the poor, lost souls who had no family to claim them, their final chapter, written not in marble, but in the silent, forgiving soil of the woods they had loved. The child ghosts gathered around the sunken earth, their silvery forms becoming transparent, their outlines blurring. They looked at her one last time, their expressions no longer fearful but placid, accepting, and in that final silent exchange she understood their plea. It was not for vengeance or for justice, it was for remembrance. They feared not the pain of their death, but the terror of being forgotten, of fading into the absolute oblivion of a story never told. As they dissolved into the night, leaving her alone before the hidden grave, a vow solidified in Ilara's heart, as cold and hard as the earth beneath her feet. She would not let them be forgotten. Her notes, her recordings, her very purpose, it all coalesced into a single burning mission. She would document their story. She would give voice to their laughter and their tears. She would etch their brief, tragic lives onto the permanent record of her work, a testament against the relentless erosion of time. They would have a voice. They would be remembered. Standing in the darkness, she made a promise to the silent earth and to the vanished children. Their small, lost souls would not be just another whisper in the wind. They would be a story, and she would be the one to tell it, a shield against the crushing silence of oblivion. There is a special kind of silence that belongs to places steeped in verse, a quiet that feels less like an absence of sound and more like a held breath before a sublime, unspoken line. The Quantocks held this silence, a rolling landscape of heather-clad hills and deep, wooded combes that seemed to have been shaped not by glaciers, but by meter and rhyme. Ilara felt it the moment she left the road, a subtle pressure in the air, as if the very atoms were straining to arrange themselves into a perfect sonnet. This was a land that had inspired the romantic poets, a place where nature was not just scenery, but a living muse, and as she walked the winding paths, she could almost feel the ghost of their fervent footsteps echoing beside her own. But a muse, she was learning, could be a demanding and dangerous companion. The day was clear, the sky a soft watercolor blue, but the beauty felt deceptive. The path led her through sun-dappled beech woods, the light filtering through the leaves in shifting golden patterns. It was idyllic, a picture of pastoral England, yet an undercurrent of unease tugged at her senses. The woods were too quiet. The usual rustle of life was muted, replaced by a watchful stillness, as if the forest was listening to a conversation, happening just beyond the edge of hearing. And then she began to hear it herself. It started as a whisper on the breeze, a faint, sibilant rush that resolved not into words, but into rhythm. It was the ghost of iambic pentameter, a steady, heartbeat pulse of da-dum, 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 that seemed to emanate from the rustling leaves and the sigh of the wind through the grass. Then, layered over the rhythm, came the whispers themselves, fragments of verse, half-caught and ethereal, a sense sublime of something far more deeply interfused. The sounding cataract haunted me like a passion. What thou art we know not, what is most like thee? The lines, from Wordsworth and Shelley, swirled around her, not spoken by any single voice, but rising from the landscape itself, a collective, poetic memory breathed into the air. It was beautiful, intoxicating, but it carried a strange, melancholic weight, as if the joy that had inspired the verses had long since curdled into a perpetual creative longing. The unease solidified as she noticed the mist. It was not the slow, creeping fog of the moors, but something faster, more purposeful. It began as a few tendrils coiling up from the damp soil of a coombe, pale and insubstantial as thought. But within minutes it was pouring over the lip of the hill in a silent, milky tide, flowing down the slopes and into the woods with an unnatural speed. It swallowed the distant views, then the nearer trees, reducing the world to a radius of a dozen yards. The poetic whispers grew louder in the fog, the disembodied verses now feeling less like a welcome, and more like a cage of words closing in around her. Disoriented, she followed the path as it dipped into a deeper, more secluded valley, the mist so thick she could barely see her own feet. The whispers seemed to guide her, leading her to a small, stone-built cottage that seemed to grow from the hillside itself, its slate roof mossy and its windows dark. Smoke, thin and grey, curled from its chimney, the only sign of life in the muffled world. Driven by a need for solidity, for a voice that was not a phantom verse, she knocked on the heavy wooden door. It was opened by a man who looked as though he'd been carved from the same weathered stone as his home. He was perhaps 60, with a gaunt, intelligent face and eyes that were startlingly bright, but shadowed by a profound weariness. He did not seem surprised to see her. He introduced himself as Alistair Finch, a writer, his voice a dry, rasping counterpoint to the lush whispers of the forest. He ushered her inside to a single book-crammed room, where a small fire fought a losing battle against the damp chill. The air smelled of old paper, wood smoke, and a deep, abiding solitude. Over a cup of bitter, black tea he spoke. He had come to the Quantocks decades ago, he said, seeking the same inspiration that had called the Romantics, and he had found it. The forest was a font of creativity, a place where ideas flowed like water and words arranged themselves with impossible ease. But he had learned, too late, the price of such a gift. The forest did not merely inspire, it fed. It consumed the very creativity it sparked, drawing the energy, the passion, the very soul of the work into itself, leaving the artist drained, a hollow vessel. He gestured to a shelf filled with identical, leather-bound journals. They were all blank. He had filled them a dozen times over with masterpieces, he claimed, with novels and poems that would have shaken the literary world. But when he went to reread them, the pages were empty. The forest had taken the words back, absorbing the stories, leaving him with only the fading memory of their brilliance and a crushing creative void. The muse of the Quantocks was a jealous one, he whispered, his eyes haunted. It gave with one hand and took away with the other, leaving behind only the exquisite agony of what had been almost created, a ghost of a masterpiece that belonged not to the artist, but to the hungry, whispering woods. The fog was a prison of pearl and silence, its walls pressing in until Elara could no longer see the path, the trees, or even her own hands held trembling before her face. Alistair Finch's cottage was a lost memory, swallowed by the opalescent tide. The only reality was the mist and the whispers, which had grown from a poetic susurration to a clamorous chorus. Fragments of verse, odes to nightingales, lamentations for lost youth, paeans to treacherous beauty, swirled around her, a storm of borrowed sorrow. They were no longer inspiring, they were invasive, threading through her thoughts, supplanting her own fears with the curated melancholy of long-dead poets. The forest was not just whispering, it was composing, and she had become its unwilling subject. Disoriented and cold to the bone, she stumbled forward, her boots sinking into the sodden turf with no sense of direction. The whispers became a guide, a tangled skein of sound that pulled her deeper into the valley's heart. They promised sublime truths and profound despair in the same breath, their rhythms syncing with the frantic beating of her own heart. She was not walking of her own volition anymore. She was being led, a character in a poem she had not chosen to be part of, her own narrative slowly being erased by the forest's overwhelming voice. The ground beneath her feet began to slope upward, then leveled out onto a flat, circular platform. The mist thinned just enough to reveal the shapes looming around her, tall, rough-hewn stones standing in a wide circle, their tops lost. In the swirling vapor, it was an ancient place, a stone circle older than poetry, older than the very language the forest was now using to ensnare her. The air within the circle was different, colder, thinner, humming with a static energy that raised the fine hairs on her arms and made her teeth ache. This was the source. This was where the Quantox distilled inspiration into obsession and fed on the resulting emotional ferment. As she stepped into the center of the circle, the whispering ceased. The sudden silence was more deafening than the noise had been. And then, the apparitions began to form. They did not rise from the ground, but condensed from the mist itself, tall, gaunt figures in the flowing coats and high collars of another age. Their faces were pale and luminous, their features blurred by time, but their eyes burned with a fierce intellectual fire. They were the poets, Wordsworth, Coleridge, Shelley. Their spectral forms took up positions between the stones, turning their haunted gazes inward toward her. They began to recite, but their voices were not the vibrant instruments of creation she had imagined. They were hollow, drained, the sounds of echoes repeating echoes. They spoke not of daffodils and blissful solitude, but of the poems they had never finished, the love they had failed to hold, the ideals that had crumbled to dust. They recited odes not to joy, but to loss, the loss of inspiration, the loss of faith, the loss of self. Their words were beautiful and terrible, each perfectly crafted line a shard of ice that lodged in her heart. They were trapped here, not as men, but as the embodiment of their own most profound regrets, their creative spirits forever bound to the stone circle that had first intoxicated them. As their lament washed over her, a terrifying clarity pierced through Ilara's fear. She understood. The forest did not feed on creativity itself, but on the raw emotion that fueled it, the exquisite pain of the unfinished thought, the searing joy of a perfect line that vanishes upon waking, the crushing weight of sublime beauty that can never be fully captured. It was a symbiotic parasite, offering a glimpse of transcendent vision, and then feeding on the artist's desperate, agonizing hunger to hold on to it. Alistair Finch's blank journals were not a delusion, they were the physical evidence of the feast. And she realized with a jolt of pure horror that she was feeding it now. Her own fears, carefully catalogued and suppressed throughout her journey, the fear of failure, of not being believed, of being just another voice lost in the cacophony of the mundane world, were rising to the surface, called forth by the poet's dirge. The forest was amplifying them, using her own anxiety as kindling for its spectral performance. The chill she felt was not just from the mist. It was the cold of her own insecurities given form, the haunting fueled by the fuel she herself provided. The phantoms in the stone circle were not just echoes of the romantics, they were mirrors, reflecting her own potential future, a soul forever defined by what it had almost, but never quite, achieved. The Quantox did not create hauntings, it simply provided the stage, and her own heart supplied the ghost. The silence of the dales was a different creature altogether. It was not the watchful hush of Kielder or the poetic stillness of the Quantox, but a vast breathing quiet, born of wind-scoured fells and limestone pavements, where the only sound was the skylark's trill and the distant plaintive bleat of a sheep. It was a landscape of immense open skies and deep hidden valleys, a place where solitude felt less like loneliness and more like a natural state of being. Ilara drove along narrow, winding roads that clung to the sides of hills, the dry stone walls stitching the green fields together like a well-worn quilt. The air streaming in through her open window was clean and sharp, carrying the scent of damp grass and wild thyme. After the claustrophobic mists of the Quantox, the sheer, sweeping scale of the dales was a balm, a return to a world where the horizon was a real, tangible thing. But she knew better than to trust the pastoral peace. Beneath the idyllic surface, as always, lay a story waiting to be heard. This one carried not on a ghostly wind, but on a melodic, lonely voice calling for lost sheep. Her research had led her to a specific, secluded valley, a place marked on her map only by the faint, dotted lines of a footpath long since reclaimed by the bracken. The legend here was of a shepherdess, a young woman named Bethany, who had tended her family's flock in this very dale over a century ago. The story was simple, its tragedy rooted in the harsh realities of rural life. A sudden, brutal blizzard had swept down from the high fells without warning, separating Bethany from her flock. She had wandered for days in the whiteout, her voice growing hoarse as she called for her lost sheep, until the cold and exhaustion finally claimed her. Her body was found weeks later, when the snows melted, curled in a protective hollow as if guarding an invisible flock. Now, it was said, her spirit could still be heard on certain quiet evenings, her melodic, desperate calls echoing through the dale, forever searching for the animals she had failed to protect. Ilara parked her car where the tarmac ended and shouldered her pack. The walk into the valley was a long, gradual descent, the path little more than a sheep track that wound between outcrops of pale limestone and through fields thick with buttercups. The sun was warm on her back, the scene one of perfect bucolic tranquility. Yet, as she moved further from the road, the familiar prickle of awareness began to stir. It was not a feeling of being watched, but of being accompanied, as if the very air was holding space for another presence. She reached the floor of the dale as the afternoon began to wane, the long shadows of the fells stretching. Across the grass, like grasping fingers, in the center of the valley stood the ruins she had been looking for, the crumbling stone walls of a long-abandoned farmstead, its roof long gone, its windows empty sockets staring out at the hills. It was a poignant sight, a monument to a way of life extinguished by time and economics. She decided to make camp within the shell of the main building, the remaining walls offering some shelter from the wind that was beginning to pick up, sighing through the gaps in the stone with a low, mournful note. As she set up her tent on a patch of level ground where a stone-flagged floor lay half buried, the quality of the sound began to change. The wind's sigh seemed to catch, to form itself into a pattern. It became a voice. Faint at first, then clearer. It was a young woman's voice, high and clear as a bell, singing a simple, repetitive melody. There were no words, only a series of lilting, calling notes, a shepherd's cry meant to carry across great distances. He-oo, he-oo. It was a sound of pure, desperate longing, a siren song for lost things. It seemed to come from all around her, from the far end of the valley, from just beyond the next hill, from the very stones of the ruin itself. It was Bethany calling for her sheep. The sound wove itself into the fabric of the twilight, a haunting, beautiful counterpoint to the settling dark. Driven by an instinct she could no longer question, Ilara began to search the ruins more carefully, her headlamp beam cutting through the deepening gloom. In what had once been a small storage room, its ceiling collapsed inward. She found a pile of rubble partially covered by a fallen beam. Carefully moving the stones aside, her fingers brushed against something soft and coarse. She pulled it free. It was a woolen blanket, thick and hand-spun, its colors faded to a uniform, earthy gray. It was heavy with damp and age. And it was cold. Not the cool of the evening air, but a deep, penetrating cold that seemed to radiate from the fibers themselves, a chill that sank into her fingers and made her joints ache. It was the cold of the grave, of the long final night in the snow. A few feet away she found its mate, a small, child-sized woolen cap, similarly frozen with an unnatural cold. These were not just relics, they were anchors, objects so imbued with the shepherdess's final moments that they had become reservoirs of her enduring sorrow, physical echoes of the blizzard that had killed her, still radiating their deadly chill across the centuries. She held the frozen woolens in her hands, the melodic call still echoing in the dale outside, and knew that the ghost of Bethany was not just a voice on the wind. She was here, in the very fabric of the place, her tragedy woven into the cold stone and the colder cloth, waiting for dawn to reveal the full extent of her lonely vigil. Dawn in the dale was a slow, gentle unveiling. The first light crept over the high fells, painting the undersides of the clouds in shades of rose and gold before spilling into the valley itself, turning the dew on the grass to a field of scattered diamonds. The melodic, desperate calls for the lost sheep had faded with the night, leaving a silence that felt cleansed and expectant. Ilara stood at the entrance to the ruined farmstead, the unnatural cold of the old woodlands still a phantom ache in her hands. She watched the light flood the valley, illuminating every tussock of grass and every pale, water-worn stone in the nearby beck. And then, as the sun's first direct rays touched the lowest part of the dale, the shepherdess appeared. She did not form from mist or step from the shadows. She was simply there, solid and real-looking, as if the dawn light had sculpted her from the very air. She stood 100 yards away, near the tumbling waters of the beck, her form as substantial as Ilara's own. She was young, no more than 17, her face weathered by a life outdoors, but still soft. With youth, she wore a simple homespun dress and a thick shawl, and in her hand she held a crook carved from a single piece of ash. She was not translucent or shimmering. She looked utterly alive, save for the profound, timeless sorrow in her eyes. She did not look at Ilara, but turned her gaze toward a narrow, hidden cleft in the valley wall, a fold in the land so subtle it was almost invisible, until the morning sun cast its long, revealing shadow. She raised her arm, not in a spectral, floating gesture, but with the firm, purposeful motion of a woman pointing out a stray ewe to a fellow shepherd. Her finger was aimed directly at the hidden opening. The message was clear, an unspoken command that brooked no hesitation: follow. Without a second thought, Ilara shouldered her pack and began to walk. The shepherdess did not wait or acknowledge her. She simply began to move toward the cleft, her pace steady and sure, her form occasionally seeming to flicker, not with insubstantiality, but with the intensity of the low-angled sunlight glancing off her. The ground was rough, a tumble of limestone clints and grikes hidden by thick bracken, but the shepherdess moved with an unerring grace, her feet finding purchase where Ilara's boots slipped and skidded. The air grew colder as they approached the hidden entrance, a deep, damp chill that smelled of wet rock and something else, something ancient and sorrowful. The cleft was a narrow, steep-sided gully, its floor a jumble of boulders that had fallen from the cliffs above. It was a place the sun rarely touched, a secret chamber in the heart of the cheerful dale. The shepherdess paused at the entrance, her solid form standing sentinel, and then she pointed again, deeper into the gloom. Then she began to fade. It was not a slow dissolution, but a gentle relinquishing of substance. The vibrant colors of her dress and shawl muted, the solid lines of her body softening, until she was a mere after-image, a beautiful, sorrowful ghost, and then she was gone, leaving only the memory of her pointing finger and the imperative to go on. Ilara pushed forward, climbing over the moss-slick boulders, the cold intensifying with every step. The gully opened abruptly into a small, bowl-shaped hollow, completely enclosed by towering cliffs. And there, in the center of this natural amphitheater, she saw it. The ground was not level. It was a series of long, low, parallel mounds, grass-covered and sunken, arranged with a grim, deliberate order. They were not the graves of individuals, each marked with a stone, but the collective, anonymous resting place of a community. This was a plague pit. The Black Death, or some later, equally merciless pestilence, had swept through this isolated dale, and the living, too few and too terrified to give proper burial, had carried their dead here to this hidden place and tipped them into a common trench, covering the horror with a thin skin of earth. A profound, collective sorrow hung over the hollow, a weight of loss so vast it felt like a physical atmosphere, thick and difficult to breathe. This was the truth the shepherdess had guarded, not her own lonely death in the snow, but this far greater tragedy. She had been the guardian of this place, her spirit bound not to her lost sheep, but to this lost flock of her people. Then the air began to stir. A soft melodic humming started, so faint it was almost a vibration. It grew, resolving into a clear, sweet voice. The shepherdess had reappeared, standing at the head of the mass grave, but now she was, as she truly was, a luminous, gentle spirit, her form glowing with a soft silver light. She was singing. It was not a dirge or a lament, but a lullaby, a simple, repetitive folk tune, the kind a mother would sing to a feverish child, or a shepherdess to a frightened lamb. The notes were pure and soothing, woven from compassion and a deep, abiding care. She walked slowly along the length of the mounds, her spectral hand outstretched as if smoothing the troubled earth, her voice pouring balm onto the ancient, festering wound of this place. As she sang, a subtle change came over the hollow. The crushing weight of sorrow did not vanish, but it shifted, transforming from a sharp, screaming pain into a soft, acknowledged grief. The air seemed to warm by a degree, the oppressive silence giving way to the gentle sound of her song. She was not laying the spirits to rest by force or by ritual, but by remembrance. She was tending to them as she would have tended her flock, offering the simple, powerful medicine of being remembered, of being cared for, even centuries too late. Her song was an act of love, a final, eternal vigil for the forgotten dead of the dale. The lullaby rose to its gentle conclusion, the final note hanging in the air like a blessing before fading into the morning. The shepherdess looked toward Ilara one last time, her luminous face serene. She smiled, a small, sad, beautiful smile, and then her form dissolved into a shower of silver motes that drifted upward on a sunbeam, vanishing into the bright blue sky. The hollow was just a hollow again, a quiet, sad place in the hills. But the memory of the song remained, etched into the very air. Ilara stood amidst the sunken graves, her own eyes wet with tears. The themes of care and memory had never been so perfectly, heartbreakingly intertwined. The shepherdess's haunting had never been about her own loss, but about her sacred duty to the loss of others, a testament to the fact that the truest form of peace is not forgetfulness, but a love that endures beyond death itself, singing a lullaby to the sorrows of the world. There is a particular kind of haunting that belongs to water, a sorrow that does not fade with time but is preserved in the cold, lightless depths, a memory held in perpetual suspension. For Ilara, standing on the pebbled shore of the lake, the legend of the drowned village was not a story of a place that had been lost, but of one that had been swallowed, its life abruptly terminated, and then perfectly preserved beneath a shimmering, deceptive surface. The morning was still, the lake a perfect, unrippled mirror for the surrounding fells, their green slopes and grey crags reflected with such clarity that the world seemed doubled, one reality resting precariously upon the ghost of another. The air was cool and carried the clean, mineral scent of high water and wet stone. It was a scene of breathtaking beauty, but the beauty felt like a lid on a box, hiding a secret that was only visible when one dared to look down, not out. She had hired a small wooden canoe from a silent, weather-beaten man at a nearby jetty. It was a simple, elegant craft, its varnished wood smooth under her palms as she pushed it from the shore and climbed gingerly aboard. The dip of her paddle into the water was the only sound, a soft, rhythmic plunk that sent concentric rings expanding across the mirrored surface, momentarily shattering the perfect reflections before they slowly, patiently reformed. She paddled toward the center of the lake, toward the area where the old maps showed the village of Martindale had once stood, before the valley was flooded to create a reservoir a century ago. The locals still spoke of it in hushed tones, of the church spire that was said to sometimes break the surface on still summer nights, of the ghostly lights that could be seen moving in the deep, and of the bells that tolled from a submerged belfry, their sound muffled and mournful through the water. As she glided over the submerged site, the quality of the light on the water began to change. The bright surface reflections of the fells and sky grew dim, as if a cloud had passed over the sun, though the sky above remained a clear, untroubled blue. The water beneath her canoe darkened to a deep, impenetrable indigo. And then she saw the lights. They were not reflections, far below in the abyssal dark pinpricks. Of soft, greenish-white light began to flicker on one by one. They were the windows of drowned cottages, the lanterns of spectral streets, illuminating a world that existed in a perpetual watery twilight. They pulsed gently, a silent phosphorescent heartbeat from the lake's cold, remembering heart. A sound joined the soft dip of her paddle, a vibration that traveled through the hull of the canoe and up through the bones of her legs. It was the deep, resonant toll of a church bell, a single, sonorous note that seemed to rise from the very depths below her. It was not loud, but it was immense, a sound that had weight and substance, the voice of the drowned belfry calling to a congregation of ghosts. The note hung in the air, a tangible presence that made the fine hairs on her arms stand on end. It was followed by another, and then another, a slow, funereal knell for a village that had died by water. Holding her breath, Elara leaned carefully over the side of the canoe, her face close to the water's surface. The mirror was broken now, the perfect reflections gone. Instead, the water had become a window. Peering down, she could see the lakebed, not as a murky, silt-covered floor, but as the streets of Martindale, clear and detailed as if she were looking through a pane of flawless glass. And she saw the figures. They were not floating or swimming, but walking. Silhouettes of men, women, and children moved along the submerged lanes, going about their daily business as if the water were mere air. A woman carried a basket over her arm. A man tipped his hat to a neighbor. Children chased an invisible dog between the ghostly outlines of stone cottages. They were solid, real, and utterly unaware of the world above, trapped in the final, ordinary moment before the deluge, their lives preserved in a silent, sunken amber. The reflections in the water were not of the sky and the fells, but of the village itself, a perfect, inverted world where the dead walked and church. Bells tolled in a cemetery without graves, a haunting not of violence or vengeance, but of a life interrupted and forever held in the cold, clear memory of the deep. The surface of the lake was a boundary, not just between air and water, but between the present and a past held in perfect, liquid stasis. The ghostly lights below, the tolling of the submerged bell, the silent, walking figures, they were a siren call Elara could no longer resist. The canoe felt flimsy, a temporary vessel on the skin of another world. She needed to cross that boundary, to step through the window and into the memory. The next morning, she returned to the shore, armed not with a paddle, but with a rented set of scuba gear, the heavy tank and tight-fitting mask feeling both alien and like the most natural tools for the journey she was about to take. The water was shockingly cold, a biting embrace that seeped through her wetsuit the moment she slipped beneath the surface. The world above vanished in a roar of bubbles, replaced by a green, filtered silence. Sunlight pierced the water in long, wavering columns, illuminating swirling motes of sediment like dust in a forgotten cathedral. She descended slowly, equalizing the pressure in her ears, her fins pushing her down into the deepening gloom. The familiar landscape of the lakebed, rocks, weeds, the occasional sunken log, gave way to something else. The outlines of foundations emerged from the silt, the skeletons of cottages and dry stone walls forming a ghostly grid on the bottom. She was here. She was in the streets of Martindale. And then, the water around her began to change. The cold lessened, replaced by a strange, ambient warmth. The greenish tint of the light shifted, warming to the gold of a late summer afternoon. The silt and the weeds dissolved, and the ruins around her rebuilt themselves. Stone walls rose, whole and solid, their mortar fresh. Slate roofs appeared overhead, though she could still see the surface of the lake shimmering. Far above, like a distorted sky. The silence was broken by the sounds of life, the distant lowing of a cow, the chatter of unseen children, the rhythmic clang of a blacksmith's hammer from a phantom forge. The submerged village was no longer a ruin, it was alive, vibrant, and she was floating, weightless, through its bustling, sun-drenched lanes. The spirits were no longer indistinct silhouettes. They were fully realized, their faces clear and animated, their clothes the simple, hard-wearing fabrics of a century past. A woman hung washing on a line that stretched across a street that no longer existed, her humming a cheerful, muffled melody in the water air. A group of old men sat on a bench outside a pub that was now only a foundation, sharing a silent laugh, the tankards in their hands solid and real. Children kicked a leather ball in a village green that was now a bed of aquatic plants. The vision was not a morbid reenactment of their deaths, but a generous, heartbreaking gift, a showing of their daily lives, their simple joys, their community, all that had been lost when the waters rose. They were not ghosts of sorrow, but spirits of remembrance, sharing the story of what was, not just the tragedy of its end. The vision guided her, a current of memory pulling her toward the heart of the village, where the church spire pointed toward the surface like an accusatory finger. She drifted through its open doorway, into the cool, quiet interior. Sunlight, filtered through the water, streamed through the now clear windows, painting the stone floor with shifting liquid patterns. And there, on a pew near the front, as if waiting for her, a small tarnished silver locket lay, its chain coiled neatly beside it. It was not a phantom object. It was solid, real, a piece of the past that had endured. Her gloved hand closed around it, the metal cold even through the neoprene. The moment her fingers made contact, a final, powerful wave of emotion washed over her, not of the floods. Terror, but of the love that had defined this place. The love of a mother for a child, of neighbors for one another, of a community for its home. The vision began to fade, the warm golden light cooled back to the deep green of the lake. The sounds of life muted, replaced by the profound silence of the deep. The solid walls of the cottages and the church became translucent, then vanished, leaving only their crumbling foundations on the silt. The spirits, with one last collective look of peaceful acknowledgement, dissolved back into the water from which they had come. Ilara kicked for the surface, her heart pounding, the locket clutched tightly in her fist. She broke through into the blinding light and cold air of the present, gasping, the weight of the tank suddenly immense on her back. She paddled back to the shore in a daze, the contrast between the vibrant village in her mind and the silent, beautiful lake around her, almost too much to bear. Sitting on the pebbles, water pooling around her, she opened her hand. The locket lay on her palm, a small, unassuming piece of silver, its surface etched with a pattern of intertwined leaves. She pressed the catch, and it sprang open. Inside was a tiny, faded photograph of a young woman, her smile gentle and her eyes full of a future that had been stolen. On the other side, a single curling lock of fair hair, holding this tangible fragment of a lost life. The full, crushing weight of her journey settled upon Ilara. The hanged man, the soot-covered child, the lost soldiers, the weeping shepherdess. They were all like this locket. They were stories. Fragile, precious stories that time and water and indifference were constantly trying to erode, to sink into the silt of oblivion. The hauntings were not the problem. They were the symptom. They were the stories fighting back, refusing to be erased, demanding to be heard and remembered. Her purpose, she realized with a clarity that was both terrifying and exhilarating, was not to prove the existence of ghosts. It was to be a bulwark against time's relentless erosion. It was to listen, to record, to preserve, to ensure that the lockets of the world, both literal and metaphorical, were not lost to the deep but brought to the surface, their stories told, their lives honored against the silent, forgetting tide of the years. The highlands did not simply occupy space, they commanded it, a sprawling, elemental kingdom where the very air tasted of peat smoke, pine, and a deep, abiding silence that was older than memory. After the intimate sorrows of drowned villages and lost children, the scale of this place was a shock to the system, a vast rolling expanse of heather-clad moor and saw-toothed mountains that stretched to a horizon blurred by mist and distance. Here, the hauntings felt different, less personal and more geological, as if the land itself was replaying its own violent birth. Ilara drove for hours along single-track roads, the only signs of life the occasional stoic sheep and the dark, watchful shapes of red deer on the skyline. The sense of isolation was profound, a feeling of being a tiny, temporary speck in a landscape that measured time in glaciers and granite. It was in this epic theater that she was to meet a fellow player, another soul drawn to the echo chamber of the past. The meeting point was a bothy, a simple stone shelter tucked into the lee of a great bald hill, its presence a small, defiant act of human order against the surrounding wilderness. Smoke, pale and thin, curled from its chimney, a welcome signal in the immense grey afternoon. Pushing open the heavy wooden door, she found him already there, a man in his late 30s with the lean, weathered look of one who spent more time with maps and moorland than with people. He was bent over a portable gas stove, coaxing a kettle to boil, and looked up as she entered, his eyes, a clear, direct grey, assessing her with a quick, intelligent curiosity. He introduced himself as Alistair, his voice carrying the soft, musical lilt of the islands. He was, like her, an investigator of the uncanny, though his focus was less on folklore and more on the hard data of parapsychology. He had been tracking a specific phenomenon for weeks, the spectral reenactment of a minor but brutal clan skirmish in a remote glen a few miles to the north. Locals reported the same sounds, the clash of steel, the guttural war cries, the final choked scream, repeating with the precision of a broken record, always at the same time, under the same atmospheric conditions. Their alliance was one of immediate, practical necessity. 2 sets of eyes, 2 sets of equipment, were better than one in a place this vast and unforgiving. As they shared a pot of strong, bitter tea, they compared notes. Ilara spoke of her journey, of the patterns she was beginning to see, of the way the hauntings seemed to resonate with celestial events and the land's own traumatic memory. Alistair listened, his expression thoughtful, then presented his own, more scientific theory. He believed most hauntings were not active, intelligent entities, but psychic recordings, imprints of intense emotion left upon a location's physical structure, replaying when triggered by the right conditions. A drop in barometric pressure, a specific lunar phase, a resonance in the local electromagnetic field. They were echoes, he argued, nothing more. The debate was not antagonistic, but a meeting of 2 different languages trying to describe the same inexplicable truth. As dusk began to pool in the valleys, they shouldered their packs and hiked into the glen where the battle phantom was said to walk. The place was a natural amphitheater, a U-shaped valley carved by a long-vanished glacier, its floor a boggy mat of moss and heather, its sides rising steeply to craggy summits. The air was damp and cold, and a fine persistent drizzle began to fall, soaking everything and muting the world to shades of grey and green. It was a perfect stage for a tragedy. They worked with a quiet, efficient synergy, Alistair setting up a grid of sensitive electromagnetic field meters and motion-activated cameras on tripods, their red recording lights like malevolent eyes in the gloom, while Ilara placed her own audio recorders at strategic points, hoping to capture the subtleties the crude video might miss. They positioned themselves on a rocky outcrop that gave a commanding view of the entire glen, huddling under waterproofs as the light failed and the full wet darkness of the highland night descended. The debate continued in hushed tones, a theoretical lifeline against the oppressive, waiting silence. Were they setting traps for a ghost, or merely calibrating instruments to capture a particularly stubborn echo? In the vast, rain-swept darkness of the glen, the line between a memory and a monster felt terrifyingly thin. The rain fell not in drops, but in a fine, relentless curtain that soaked through layers of clothing and found its way into the soul, a dampness that felt as ancient as the granite beneath their feet. The glen was a bowl of absolute blackness, the kind of dark that had weight and texture, broken only by the weak green glow of the equipment displays and the occasional sweep of Alistair's powerful torch across the boggy floor below. Hours bled into one another, marked only by the slow, creeping cold and the hypnotic patter of water on waterproof fabric. The debate between echo and entity had long since fallen to silence, replaced by a shared, shivering vigilance. Then, as the digital clock on a nearby EMF meter flickered to a specific predetermined hour, the air changed. It was not a sound at first, but a pressure, a sudden violent compression of the atmosphere that made Ilara's ears pop and the equipment displays flicker erratically. The fine rain seemed to hang motionless in the air for a heartbeat, each droplet a frozen jewel in the darkness. And then the glen was filled with noise. It was not an echo from the rocks, but a presence that erupted into the space around them, the clash of steel on steel, a sharp, ringing cacophony that had no single source but seemed to come from everywhere at once. Guttural, furious war cries in a forgotten Gaelic dialect tore through the night, voices raw with the effort of killing and the terror of dying. The air grew thick with the phantom scent of peat smoke, sweat, and the coppery tang of blood. This was no faint recording, it was an immersive, brutal reliving. And then they saw him. He materialized not from the mist, but from the violence itself, a figure coalescing from the chaotic energy of the battle. A Highlander, his face a mask of grime and fury, his plaid torn and his bonnet askew. He was not translucent, but solid and terrifyingly real, his movements a blur of desperate, lethal energy. He fought not against a visible foe, but against the empty air, his broadsword arcing and parrying with invisible blades, his body twisting and lunging in a deadly dance with phantoms only he could see. Each clash of his spectral steel sent a jolt of cold energy through the glen, a psychic shockwave that vibrated in Ilara's teeth. He was not an echo, he was a man, trapped in the most violent moment of his existence, forever fighting a battle that had already claimed him. Alistair, his scientific detachment shattered, leaned forward, his face a pale oval in the gloom, his camera forgotten. He was mesmerized, his theory of passive recordings crumbling before the raw, conscious agony of the performance. Driven by an instinct he would later curse, he scrambled down from the outcrop, his torch beam darting erratically as he moved closer, wanting a better angle, wanting to prove to himself that this was real. He was 20 feet from the battling Highlander when it happened. The Spectre, in the midst of a furious parry against an unseen attack, was struck a blow from his invisible opponent. He staggered, a silent roar of pain contorting his features. And in that moment of spectral injury, his broadsword, a weapon of memory and anguish, lashed out in a final reflexive arc. It was not aimed at Alistair, but it passed directly through the space he occupied. There was no physical impact, no sound of tearing flesh. But Alistair cried out, a short, sharp gasp of shock and pain, and crumpled to the wet ground as if his legs had been severed. The torch flew from his hand, its beam cartwheeling across the heather before going dark. The battle sounds cut off instantly, the pressure in the air vanishing as if a switch had been thrown. The Highlander was gone. The glen was silent once more, save for the hiss of the rain and Alistair's ragged, pained breathing. Ilara was at his side in seconds, her own fear forgotten. In the faint glow from the equipment on the ridge, she could see his face was ashen, his jaw clenched tight. He clutched at his thigh, his fingers probing a spot where there was no wound, no blood, no mark of any kind, yet he winced in agony. A spectral blade, a memory of steel, had passed through him and left a wound that was not physical, but spiritual. A deep, bone-chilling cold and a tearing sensation that defied medical explanation. It was an injury inflicted by the past itself, a direct, violent intersection of then and now. She helped him back to the relative shelter of the outcrop, her arm around his waist, his weight heavy against her. His scientific certainty was gone, replaced by a dazed, painful confusion. She tended to him as best she could, wrapping him in an emergency blanket to fight the shock and the unnatural cold that seemed to be radiating from his body. There were no words, only the shared, shivering reality of what had just happened. The past was not a passive recording. It could reach out. It could draw blood or something very like it. As the long, cold hours until dawn dragged on, their bond was forged in the shared risk and the blurring of past and present. The line Alistair had so confidently drawn between echo and entity had not just been crossed, it had been annihilated by a ghostly broadsword. Huddled together against the Highland night, the phantom battle's aftermath was not a collection of data points on a screen, but the pained breathing of the man beside her, and the terrifying knowledge that the stories they pursued were not just stories. They were live wires, crackling with a power that could, and would, interact with the present in ways both beautiful and brutal, binding the living to the dead in a shared perilous dance across the thinning veil. There is a sound that belongs not to the wind or the beast, but to the raw, unraveling edge of the soul, a keen, a wail that promises not just sorrow, but the absolute cessation of hope. It is the sound of the banshee, and its legend clung to the high granite shoulders of the Mourne Mountains like the very mist that wreathed their peaks. Crossing the border into Northern Ireland, Ilara felt the shift immediately. The landscape here was not one of gentle rolling hills or deep mystical woods, but of stark elemental power. The Mournes were a fortress of rock thrust up from the earth, their slopes a patchwork of tough heather and scree, their summits sharp and challenging against a sky the color of bruised slate. The air was sharp and clean, carrying the scent of damp earth and cold stone, but beneath it, carried on the constant, moaning wind, was the ghost of that terrible cry, a story waiting to be given voice. She began her climb of Slieve Donard, the highest of the peaks, its bulk a dark presence looming over the coastal town of Newcastle. The path was steep and unrelenting, a relentless ascent over loose stone and boggy ground that burned in her thighs and stole the breath from her lungs. The wind, which had been a murmur in the valley, became a constant howling companion on the exposed mountainside. It did not simply blow, it screamed. It tore at her. Clothes whipped her hair across her face and funneled through the rocky gullies with a voice that was unnervingly human. It was a low, mournful howl that would suddenly rise in pitch to a sharp, piercing shriek, a perfect mimicry of a woman's grief-stricken wail. With every gust, Ilara felt a fresh chill that had nothing to do with the temperature, a primal dread that coiled in her stomach. The legends said the banshee's cry was a herald, an omen of death for those who heard it. Here on the mountain, the wind itself seemed to be the banshee, its endless, sorrowful performance a warning to all who dared to climb into its domain. As she neared the saddle between Donard and its neighboring peak, the wind grew even fiercer, forcing her to lean into its invisible pressure. The view was breathtaking, a sweeping panorama of the Irish Sea and the patchwork countryside below, but the beauty was underscored by a profound sense of isolation and vulnerability. It was then that she saw the old woman. She was sitting on a flat-topped boulder just off the path, a small, hunched figure wrapped in a thick, dark shawl, her face a web of deep lines carved by a lifetime of mountain weather. She seemed as much a part of the landscape as the granite itself, her presence both unexpected and inevitable. In her gnarled hands, she held a walking stick of blackthorn, and her eyes, pale and milky with age, were fixed on Ilara with an unnerving intensity. Ilara approached slowly, the wind snatching at her words as she offered a greeting. The old woman did not smile. She simply stared, her gaze seeming to look through Ilara's skin and into the weary, fear-touched core of her. After a long moment she spoke, her voice a dry rasp that was somehow clearer than the wind's roar. "You hear the crying on the wind," she said, not a question but a statement of fact. "You think it's just the air in the stones. It is not." She shifted on her rock, her shawl tightening around her thin shoulders. "The bean cedar does not bring the death. She only tells of it. She is a messenger, a mourner for the old families, but for those like you, wanderer, those who listen too closely to the old places. For you, the hearing of her is the warning itself. Her voice gets into your bones. It calls to the sorrow you carry and the sorrow you seek. To listen is to invite the darkness. It is to tie your own fate to the ending of things." Her words landed not as superstition, but as a cold, hard truth, a key turning in a lock deep within Ilara's soul. The old woman fell silent, her milky eyes still holding Ilara's, a living monument to the mountain's grim wisdom. Then she simply turned her head away, gazing out over the vast wind-scoured landscape, her audience clearly ended. The message was delivered. The banshee was not a ghost to be found, but a consequence to be feared. Her cry was not a story from the past, it was a promise for the future, a herald of death for those foolish enough to lend it their ear. And Ilara, climbing ever higher into the screaming wind, knew with a sickening certainty that she had been listening, truly listening, for a very long time. The mountain pass was a place of screaming stone. The wind, funneled between the high granite peaks, became a physical force, a torrent of invisible fury that tore at Ilara's coat and threatened to pluck her from the narrow, exposed path. It was no longer just a sound, it was a presence, a conscious, malevolent entity that used the air as its vocal cords. The old woman's warning echoed in her mind, a chilling counterpoint to the gale's roar. To listen is to invite the darkness. But Elara was far beyond the choice of listening. Here, in this high, desolate place, the darkness was doing the talking. She fought her way forward, head down, each step a battle against the wind's shoving hands. The path wound through a jumble of colossal boulders, their surfaces scoured smooth by centuries of this elemental abuse. The light was failing, the sky deepening to a bruised twilight purple, and the temperature plummeted, the cold seeping through her layers with a wet, clinging persistence. It was in the lee of the largest boulder, a great brooding sentinel of granite, that the wind's scream suddenly changed. It shifted from a chaotic, polyphonic howl to a single, focused and horrifyingly clear sound, the high, wavering keen of a woman in absolute soul-destroying grief. The sound cut through the gale, sharper than any blade, a vibration of pure despair that seemed to freeze the very air in Elara's lungs. She stumbled to a halt, her heart seizing in her chest. The wind died around her, dropping to an unnerving pocket of stillness, as if the mountain itself was holding its breath. And there, standing between her and the path ahead, was the banshee. She was not a misty apparition or a trick of the fading light. She was solid, stark, and terrifyingly real. A tall, gaunt woman draped in robes of a grey so deep it seemed to absorb what little light remained. Her hair was long and wild, the colour of tarnished silver, whipping about a face that was little more than a pale, skeletal mask. Her eyes were hollow sockets of shadow, and from her thin, bloodless lips issued the terrible, unending wail, a sound that was not of this world, a lament for the dying that was itself a kind of death. The air around her was frigid, a dry, absolute cold that burned Elara's exposed skin and made the rocks glitter with a faint, hoarfrost rime. Paralyzed, Elara could only watch as the spectre's head turned slowly, those empty eye sockets fixing upon her. The wailing did not cease, but it seemed to deepen, to focus, its sorrow now directed solely at her. This was the omen. This was the herald of death the old woman had warned her about. The banshee was not here for some distant old family. She was here for Elara, her cry a funeral dirge composed for the investigator who had pried too deep into the world's sorrows. Then, the banshee moved, one arm, unnaturally long and ending in a hand of bone and translucent skin, rose from the folds of her grey robe. A single bony finger, pale as moon-bleached driftwood, extended. It did not point at Elara, but past her, beyond the circle of stillness, toward the dark, brooding expanse of a specific forest that clung to the lower slopes of the opposite mountain. The gesture was unmistakable, an imperative etched in terror. The finger remained, steady and accusing, its direction as clear as a signpost to hell. The overarching curse she had been piecing together, the connected sorrow of Epping, Thetford, Savernake, all of them, was pointing her toward its next chapter, its next reservoir of pain. The banshee was not just heralding a personal end, she was a guide to the very heart of the malignancy she sought to understand. The wail rose to a final piercing crescendo, a sound that felt like needles driven into Elara's ears. Then, as abruptly as it had begun, it stopped. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the scream. The banshee's form seemed to fray at the edges, dissolving into strands of cold grey mist that were snatched away by the returning wind. In a moment, she was gone. The unnatural stillness vanished, and the full force of the gale slammed back into Elara, making her stagger. Trembling uncontrollably, her body humming with residual terror, she fumbled in her pack with numb, clumsy fingers. She pulled out her notebook, the pages whipping and snapping in the wind. Holding it tight against her chest, she managed to uncap her pen. Her hand shook so violently she could barely form the letters. She did not write a description, she scrawled a record of the omen itself. Sleeve Bernard Pass, dusk, the banshee, grey robes, a wail that stops the heart. She pointed, there. She drew a frantic, jagged arrow in the direction the bony finger had indicated, toward the dark, waiting forest. The omen is for me. It is a direction. It is all. Connected, The curse has a map, and she just gave me the next coordinate. She stuffed the notebook back into her pack, her breath coming in ragged, panicked gasps. The fear was a live thing in her gut, colder than the mountain air. But beneath the terror, a grim, determined clarity was taking root. The banshee's cry was not just a warning of death, it was a clue. The Morn Mountains were not an end, but a crossroads. The path forward was clear, lit by the ghost light of a wailing woman in grey, and it led directly into the heart of the next haunted wood, drawing her inexorably closer to the source of the sorrow that bound all the forests together. The earth remembers its dead not in silent tombs, but in the echoing chambers of its own hollow heart. The Peak District did not wear its sorrow on its surface, in the sweeping, heather-clad moors or the picturesque stone villages nestled in the valleys. Its hauntings were subterranean, a legacy carved into the limestone bones of the land in the vast labyrinthine cave systems that riddled the dark beneath the green. Here, the phantoms were not of hanged men or lovelorn maids, but of industry, of the countless miners and lost travelers who had ventured into the lightless deep and never found their way back to the sun. Their stories were not whispered on the wind, but on the drip of water and the faint, persistent echo of a pickaxe striking rock from a tunnel sealed for a century. Elara felt the pull of the deep the moment she left her car at the mouth of a lesser-known cave system, one marked on old maps with a single, ominous word, Watcher's Drop. The air that exhaled from the cave's gaping maw was cold and damp, carrying the scent of wet stone, ancient stillness, and something else, the faint metallic tang of old iron and a profound, patient loneliness. The entrance was a jagged tear in the hillside, partially obscured by a curtain of ivy and hawthorn, as if the land itself was trying to heal the wound. Switching on. Her headlamp, its beam a frail, defiant spear into the absolute blackness, she stepped over the threshold, crossing from the world of light and living things into the kingdom of stone and memory. The descent was immediate and steep, a narrow, slippery path that wound down between walls of glistening, water-sculpted rock. The sounds of the surface world, the sigh of the wind, the call of a distant bird, vanished, swallowed by the immense, absorbing silence of the cave. The only sounds were the crunch of her boots on gravel, the frantic thrum of her own heart, and the constant, maddening drip, drip, drip of water percolating through the limestone ceiling. Her beam danced over formations of stunning, alien beauty, stalactites hanging like stone icicles, flowstone cascading down the walls in frozen waterfalls, delicate helictites twisting in impossible, crystalline spirals. It was a cathedral built by time and water, a place of sublime, terrible beauty that felt both sacred and deeply unwelcoming. She moved deeper, following the main passage as it sloped ever downward, the air growing colder and heavier with every step. The sense of being watched, which had been a constant companion on her journey, intensified here, but it was different. It was not the intelligent gaze of the Kielder Watcher or the predatory stare of the Galloway beast. This was a multitude, a collective silent observation from the countless sealed side tunnels and fissures that branched off from the main passage. She felt the weight of unseen eyes from the dark mouths of shafts that dropped away into nothingness, from behind curtains of stalactites, from the impenetrable blackness ahead. They were the phantom miners, the spirits of those who had carved these tunnels and then been entombed by them, their presence a cold, patient pressure in the stale air. After what felt like an hour of careful descent, the passage opened abruptly into a vast, soaring cavern. Her headlamp beam was swallowed by the immensity, failing to reach the distant ceiling or the far walls. The space was so large it seemed to generate its own weather. A faint cold breeze stirred the air, carrying the scent of millennia of undisturbed dust. And there, covering one entire wall of the cavern, were the carvings. They were not the crude scratches of a modern explorer, but deep, deliberate glyphs etched into the limestone with tools of flint or antler. They depicted spirals, concentric circles, zigzag lines, and stylized figures with upraised arms, their meanings lost to the ages. This was a place of power, a sanctuary or a ritual site for people so ancient they had no name. Running her gloved fingers over the cool, smooth grooves, Ilara felt a jolt of connection, not to the individual miners, but to the land's primordial memory, a time when the dark was not a place of industry, but of worship. It was then, in the profound silence of the ancient cavern, that the sound began. It was faint at first, a distant rhythmic clink, clink, clink that seemed to come from deep within the rock itself. It was the sound of a pickaxe, a ghostly miner still working a vein that had been exhausted 100 years before. The sound was not menacing, but profoundly sorrowful, the echo of a life defined by relentless, back-breaking toil, now repeating into eternity. It seemed to emanate from a specific nearby tunnel, its entrance now completely blocked by a brutal, modern-looking wall of concrete and rusted iron bars, a deliberate final seal. The phantom miner was in there, trapped, his labor his only company in the endless dark. The clink, clink, clink was his heartbeat, his lament, his prison. Ilara stood before the sealed tunnel, the ancient carvings at her back, the ghostly pickaxe in her ears, and felt the layers of time collapse upon her. She was standing at the intersection of the sacred and the industrial, the ancient and the modern, the living and the eternally, hopelessly lost, all of them watching. Her, from the silent, judging dark, the ghostly miner did not appear as a shimmering form or a trick of the light. He was a stain upon the darkness itself, a figure woven from the soot of forgotten coal seams and the chill of the deep earth. He solidified from the shadows beside the sealed tunnel, his outline sharp and real against the brutal concrete. He was a man of indeterminate age, his back permanently stooped from a lifetime spent in low passages, his clothes ragged and indistinct. In his translucent hands he held the phantom of a pickaxe, its head gleaming with a faint internal luminescence. He did not look at Ilara, but turned his head, a slow, grinding motion, and gazed down a narrow, almost invisible fissure in the cavern wall, a crack she had not noticed before. Then, without a sound, he began to drift toward it, his form gliding over the uneven floor, the ghostly tool held loosely at his side. It was not a summons, but a directive as clear and uncompromising as the rock around them. Follow. The fissure was a tight, claustrophobic squeeze, the walls pressing in until the rough limestone scraped against her shoulders. The air grew thick and stale, and the temperature plummeted to a degree that felt less like cold and more like the absence of all warmth. The ghost led her on, a silent, shimmering guide through the intestine-like passages of the mountain's heart. The journey felt endless, a descent not just in space, but in time, each step taking her further from the world of the living and deeper into the accumulated memory of the stone. The only sound was the frantic thud of her own heart and the soft, insubstantial whisper of the miner's passage. They emerged into a small, domed chamber, so perfectly hidden it felt like a secret the earth had decided to keep. And there, in the center of one wall, pulsed the source of the faint light that had illuminated the miner's pick. It was a vein of quartz, but unlike any she had ever seen. It was not a dull, milky white, but a deep, vibrant amethyst, and it throbbed with a slow, rhythmic light, as if it contained a captive heartbeat. The light was not a reflection, but emanated from within the crystal itself, casting shifting violet patterns on the dark walls of the chamber. It was beautiful, hypnotic, and profoundly unsettling. The ghostly miner stopped before it, and for the first time he turned his head fully toward Ilara. His face was a blur of toil and time, but his eyes, 2 points of the same sorrowful amethyst light, held hers. He raised a translucent hand and pointed a single, emphatic finger at the glowing vein. His message delivered, his form simply unwound, dissolving into a swirl of coal dust and cold air that was greedily absorbed by the darkness, leaving her alone with the pulsating crystal. A compulsion she could no longer fight drew her forward. Her breath plumed in the freezing air, her own small living cloud in the ancient stillness. She reached out, her bare fingertips hovering just above the cool, smooth surface of the quartz. The thrumming energy it emitted was a physical vibration in the air, a resonance that called to the very core of her being. She took a final, shuddering breath and pressed her palm flat against the stone. The world exploded. It was not a vision seen with her eyes, but an experience felt with her entire soul, a tsunami of memory that crashed over her, through her, obliterating all sense of self. She was no longer Elara in a cave, she was the hanged man, the rope a burning agony around his neck, the betrayal a cold stone in his heart. She was the soot-covered child, the darkness of the sealed shaft absolute, his final gasping breaths a silent scream in the crushing black. She was the witch in the new forest, the phantom flames licking at her feet, the pleas for mercy dying on her lips. She was the lost soldier in Thetford, marching in endless silent formation, the terror of the unseen enemy a constant companion. She was the shepherdess singing her lullaby, the grey lady gazing across her lonely loch, the poet trapped in his circle of regret. Every sorrow, every injustice, every moment of profound loss from every forest she had visited flooded into her simultaneously. They were not separate stories anymore. They were a single screaming chord of interconnected suffering, a vast wounded nervous system spanning the entire land. She felt the silver ley lines of Kielder, now pulsing with black, infected energy at each point of trauma. She felt the land itself groaning under the weight of it, the echoes not merely repeating, but feeding upon each other, growing stronger, more desperate. This was not a collection of hauntings. It was a single, vast entity of pain, a curse woven from 1,000 broken threads, and it was alive. It was aware, and it was begging for a resolution. The visions did not just show her the pain, they showed her the connections. The celestial event that had amplified the highwayman's betrayal was the same energy that had stirred the dragon in Snowdonia. The blind obedience of the soldier in Thetford was the same corrupting force that had fueled the king's tyranny in Savernake. The personal, intimate loss of the Grey Lady was a microcosm of the collective grief in the Yorkshire plague pit. They were all facets of the same fundamental rupture between humanity and the land, a wound that festered and echoed through the centuries. The flood of sensation reached a crescendo, a point of such immense collective agony that she felt her own mind would shatter under the weight. And in that moment of absolute extremity, a final, unified understanding was seared into her consciousness. This could not continue. The cycle of echoing trauma was a poison, and it was reaching a critical mass. The forests, the guardians of this forgotten knowledge, were not just haunted, they were screaming. The interconnected suffering was not a history to be documented. It was a disease to be healed, a wound that demanded a resolution. The visions had not been a gift of knowledge, but a plea for action passed from the soul of the land, through the glowing quartz and directly into her own. As the last of the memories receded, leaving her trembling and gasping on the cold floor of the chamber, one truth remained, clear and unchallengeable. Her journey was over. The time for observation had passed. The time for a resolution had begun. The ghost of the highwayman does not ride on the wind, but on the memory of fear, the sharp, metallic taste of it in the back of the throat, the cold clutch of it in the gut of a lone traveller on a dark road. For Elara, driving through the rolling, beach-clad hills of the Chilterns long after midnight, that fear was a theoretical thing, a flavour of a story she was hunting. Her headlights carved tunnels through the absolute blackness, illuminating the high wooded banks that hemmed in the narrow lane, their branches interlacing overhead to form a living vault. The air coming through her cracked window was cool and carried the rich, loamy scent of leaf litter and damp earth. This was the territory of a different kind of phantom, not a sorrowful spirit or a primal beast, but a rogue, a gentleman of the road, whose legend was written in the glint of a pistol and the jingle of stolen coin. Her research pointed to a spectral figure known as the Black Rider, a highwayman who had haunted these very lanes in the 18th century, his reign of terror ending not at the gallows, but in a mysterious disappearance, leaving behind only a trail of terrified accounts and the promise of an eternal predatory patrol. She was chasing the echo of that promise, her notes on the passenger seat a testament to the patterns she now understood. The celestial alignments, the lay of the land, the specific emotional resonance of the trauma, all of it pointed to this lonely stretch of road as a place where the veil would be thin tonight. The road began to climb. Winding up a steep incline, the engine of her small car groaning with the effort. The woods pressed in closer, the darkness between the trunks becoming absolute, a solid wall of night. It was then, at the very apex of the hill, that the car coughed. A single jarring sputter that was more felt than heard. A warning light flickered on the dashboard, a dull orange eye of malfunction. Then, with a final resigned sigh, the engine died completely. The sudden silence was a physical blow. The hum of the engine, the rush of the tires, all of it vanished, leaving only the thick, watchful quiet of the woods. The dashboard lights winked out, plunging the interior into near-total darkness, save for the weak green glow of the clock. She was stranded, utterly alone, on a deserted road cresting a hill in the deepest part of the night. Turning the key yielded nothing, not even a click. The battery was dead, the electrical system a complete void. It was an impossibility, a modern failure that felt unnervingly like a prelude to something ancient. She sat for a long moment, her hands gripping the cold steering wheel, her breath the only sound. The theoretical fear was no longer theoretical. It was here, in the silence, in the dead machine around her, in the oppressive weight of the trees. Pushing open the car door, the sound of the latch was a gunshot in the quiet. She stepped out onto the tarmac, the cold night air raising goosebumps on her arms. The moon, a thin, bone-white sliver, offered little light, casting the world in monochrome and deep, impenetrable shadow. She looked back the way she had come, then ahead to where the road dipped into a blacker darkness. There was nothing. No distant lights of a farmhouse, no sound of another vehicle, only the Chilterns sleeping their deep, secret sleep. And then she heard it. A sound that did not belong to the night. A soft, rhythmic jingling, like tiny bells, but with a harder, metallic edge. Spurs. It was the sound of spurs accompanied by the soft, steady clop of a hoof on tarmac. The sounds were coming from the darkness ahead, from the dip in the road where her headlights had failed to reach. They were slow, deliberate, unhurried. The rhythm of someone or something that had all the time in the world. Her blood turned to ice water. She stood frozen beside her dead car, a statue of dread. A figure emerged from the gloom, resolving from the shadows as if it had been waiting there all along. A man on a large, dark horse. He was tall and cloaked, his face hidden in the deep shadow of a wide-brimmed hat. The moonlight glinted dully on the buckles of his boots and the metal of his bridle. He rode with an easy, arrogant grace, the jingling of his spurs marking the tempo of his approach. He drew closer, and the air grew cold, a deep, grave cold that had nothing to do with the night air. He brought his horse to a halt a dozen paces from her, the animal stamping once, its breath pluming in two great, ghostly clouds. The highwayman sat perfectly still for a long moment, a cutout of darkness against the lesser dark of the road. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion that was both elegant and terrifying, he raised his arm. In his hand was a long-barreled pistol. Ilara watched, her heart a trapped bird beating against her ribs as his thumb drew back the hammer. The sound was small, precise, and devastatingly loud in the silence. Click-clack. The sound of a pistol cocking, a promise of violence frozen in time, a single metallic note that hung in the frigid air between them, a question that had been asked on this road for centuries, and to which she now had to find an answer. The cocked pistol was not aimed at her heart, but at the space between them, a symbolic threat more chilling than any direct menace. The highwayman's face remained a mystery, lost in the shadow of his hat, but his posture spoke of an authority that transcended the mortal fear he was meant to inspire. This was no mere echo of a criminal. It was an examination. The frigid air around him seemed to still, the faint rustle of the beech leaves ceasing as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for her response. He did not speak, but an intent pressed into her mind, as clear and sharp as the sound of the hammer locking back. It was a demand, a toll, not for her purse or her life, but for the weighty, leather-bound notebook she clutched in her trembling hand. Her notes, the compiled sorrows, the mapped patterns, the intimate confessions of a dozen haunted forests. He wanted it all. A cold defiance, born from the depths of the empathy she had cultivated, rose within her, momentarily overpowering the terror. This was not a transaction to be made at the point of a ghostly gun. The stories were not currency, they were trusts. The hanged man's final breath, the child's cold touch, the shepherdess's lullaby, they were sacred. To hand them over to this spectre of the road would be the ultimate betrayal. Her fingers tightened around the notebook, pressing it against her chest as if shielding a living thing. She shook her head, a slow, deliberate motion. The refusal was silent, but it echoed in the frozen clearing louder than any shout. For a long moment, nothing happened. The highwayman remained motionless, the pistol unwavering, the horse's breath still pluming in the unnatural cold. Then, a subtle shift occurred. The aggressive tension in the spectre's posture seemed to relax. The predatory stance softened into something else, something akin to respect or perhaps satisfaction. The pistol in his hand did not lower, but it seemed to lose its menace, becoming merely an object, a prop in a play whose final act had just been rewritten. And then, he vanished. It was not a fading or a dissolution. One moment he was there, a solid, threatening figure astride his dark steed, and the next he was simply gone. The space he had occupied was empty. The crushing cold lifted so abruptly it felt like a physical blow, the ordinary chill of the night rushing back in to fill the void. The jingle of spurs and the sound of hoofbeats were absent. There was no retreating echo. He had been there, and then he was not. Elara stood alone on the dark road, her heart hammering, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The silence was broken only by the returning whisper of the wind in the trees. She looked down, half expecting the encounter to have been a hallucination born of fatigue and fear. But there, on the damp tarmac where the horse's spectral hooves had stood, something glinted in the weak moonlight. A small circular object. She knelt, her legs unsteady, and picked it up. It was a coin, old and heavy, made of a tarnished silver that felt strangely warm in her palm, as if it had just been pressed from a living hand. She turned it over, angling it to catch the meager light. One side was worn almost smooth, but the other was clear. Stamped upon it was a symbol, a single, stylized eye, from which radiated a series of interlocking spirals that resembled both the branches of a tree and the arms of a galaxy. Her breath caught in her throat. She knew this symbol. She had seen it, or variations of it, scratched into the quartz of the Peak District cave, woven into the carvings of Wistman's wood, hinted at in the celestial dragon of Snowdonia. It was the same unifying motif that had pulsed in her vision of the interconnected ley lines. The realization struck her with the force of a physical blow. The highwayman had not been a phantom demanding tribute. He had been a guardian, a sentinel placed on this road not to rob travelers, but to test them. His demand for her notes had been the ultimate question. Did she seek these stories for personal gain, for sensationalism, for the cold thrill of the chase? Or did she value them, protect them, understand their sacred weight? Her refusal had been the correct answer. It had proven her intentions were pure, that she was not a thief of sorrow, but a keeper of it. He had vanished because his purpose was served. He was not a ghost to be documented, but a gatekeeper she had passed. The coin in her hand was not a toll paid, it was a key given. The symbol linking all the haunted sites was now a physical object she could hold, a tangible piece of the puzzle. It connected Epping to the Trossachs, Thetford to the Morns, proving beyond doubt that the curse, the haunting, the echoing sorrow, it was all one single vast entity. The forests were not separate chapters, but paragraphs in a single terrible, beautiful story, and she had just been handed the Rosetta Stone. Clutching the warm, ancient coin, Elara looked back at her silent, dead car, then up at the star-dusted sky between the branches. The journey was no longer about finding answers. It was about what she was meant to do with them. The final act was approaching, and the guardian of the Chilterns had just confirmed she was on the right path. Every journey has its true north, a point on the map where all the wandering paths converge, not by accident, but by a gravity of purpose. For Elara, that point was the North York Moors. She felt it the moment she crested the rise, and the vast, heather-clad expanse unfolded before her, a great, rolling sea of purple and gold, under a sky of immense, untroubled blue. This was not a landscape that whispered or screamed. It breathed with a deep, final exhalation, a sigh of culmination. The air was clean and sharp, scented with blooming gorse and the dry, sweet perfume of the heather. But beneath it, thrumming in the very soil, was the resonance of everything that had come before. The hanged man's jerk, the dragon's roar, the banshee's wail, the child's cold touch. They were all here, not as echoes, but as notes in a single, concluding chord. This was the place where the symphony of sorrow was meant to find its resolution. She drove slowly along a narrow track that wound its way into the heart of the moors, leaving the last outpost of civilization behind. The coin from the Chilterns highwayman lay heavy in her pocket, its strange warmth a constant, reassuring presence against her thigh, a compass needle pointing ever forward. The symbol upon it, the eye with its spiraling arms, seemed to pulse in time with her own heartbeat, a silent guide. She stopped the car where the track petered out into a footpath and stepped out into the immense, open silence. The wind, a constant, gentle force, swept across the moor, combing the heather into waves and carrying the lonely cry of a curlew. It was a landscape that demanded introspection, a vast empty chapel where a soul could not hide from itself. She began to walk, not with the purposeful stride of an investigator, but with the slow, deliberate pace of a pilgrim approaching a shrine. She held the coin in her hand, its metal warm against her palm, and let the symbol guide her. It was not a conscious navigation, it was a pulling, a subtle magnetic draw that bypassed her rational mind and spoke directly to the part of her that had absorbed the visions in the quartz cave. Her feet found a path that was not on any map, a faint indentation in the heather trod by sheep, and something else, something older. She climbed a gentle rise, and there, silhouetted against the sky on the crest of the next hill, was her destination. A stone circle. It was not grand like Stonehenge, but more intimate, a ring of a dozen weathered, shoulder-high monoliths, standing in a perfect silent council. They were ancient, their surfaces pitted and scarred by millennia of wind and rain, yet they stood with an unshakable permanence, their arrangement humming with a quiet, potent energy. As she approached, the air within the circle grew still, the wind seeming to part around it, creating a pocket of profound calm. The symbol on the coin felt as if it were burning in her hand, and she knew with a certainty that went beyond knowledge that this was the place, the culmination. And she was not alone. Seated on a low, flat stone within the circle was a man. He was not old, yet he carried an air of immense age, as if the centuries had washed over him without leaving a mark. His hair was the color of the moorland grass in winter, and his eyes were the calm, clear grey of the sea on a still day. He was dressed in simple, practical clothing, but there was an aura about him, a stillness that was more than human. He looked up as she entered the circle, and his gaze held no surprise, only a deep, welcoming recognition, as if he had been waiting for her for a very long time. "You have walked a long road," he said, his voice a low, melodic rumble that seemed to vibrate in the stones beneath their feet. It was not a question. Elara simply nodded, her own voice trapped somewhere between awe and exhaustion. She held out the coin, the symbol facing him. A faint smile touched his lips. "The key of the Guardians. You have proven yourself worthy of it." He gestured for her to sit on a nearby stone. "I am a descendant," he continued, his gaze sweeping over the circle, "of the ones who first understood the pact, the ones who built this place and others like it, not as temples, but as anchors." He began to speak, and his words were not a story, but a transmission of memory, painting a picture in the air between them. He spoke of a time when the world was younger, when the veil between the spirit of the land and the spirit of humanity was thin, a permeable membrane. The forests, the moors, the mountains, they were not just places but living entities, vast conscious presences. And humanity, in its infancy, lived in dialogue with them. But as humanity grew, as its capacity for trauma, for violence, for profound sorrow intensified, a rupture occurred. The land, in its infinite empathy, began to absorb these shocks. Every act of betrayal, every moment of terror, every instance of unjust death was not forgotten, but taken into the earth, like a toxin. The ritual, the man said, his voice grave, was not a spell to create power. It was an act of balance, a sacred agreement. My ancestors, the Druids, understood that the land could not bear this accumulating weight forever. They established these points of power, these stone circles at the confluence of ley lines, as places to perform a great working. They would gather the pain, the echoes, the nascent hauntings, and through ritual and focused intent, they would transmute them. They would not erase the memory, but quiet its scream, allow it to be integrated as history, not as a perpetual bleeding wound. They bound the forests to this purpose, making them sanctuaries and recycling plants for the soul's pain. The ritual was a covenant to prevent the land from being driven mad by the sorrows of those who walked upon it. He looked at her, his grey eyes holding the weight of ages. But the knowledge faded. The rituals were forgotten. The keepers died out, and the pain has been accumulating, cycle upon cycle, growing stronger, more coherent. The hauntings you have witnessed are not the cause of the unrest, they are the symptom of a covenant broken. The land is choking on the grief it was never meant to hold alone. The ancient ritual that bound the forests is failing, and what you have followed is not a trail of ghosts but the fault lines of a world suffering a spiritual breakdown. Ilara listened, the truth settling into her bones, cold and absolute. The highwayman's test, the watcher's vision, the banshee's omen, they had all been leading her here, to this circle of stones, and this man who held the final, missing piece of the story. She was not just a chronicler, she had been chosen, prepared, and guided to the heart of the rupture. The culmination of her journey was not an answer, but a responsibility. The ancient ritual needed to be performed again, and she was the only one left who could do it. The choice was a chasm, and Ilara stood at its precipice, the two futures yawning. Before her, like divergent stars. On one side lay the world she knew, a world of whispering trees and weeping stones, of phantoms trapped in their endless, agonizing loops, a world alive with the beautiful, terrible music of unrest. It was the world of the hanged man's final breath, the child's cold hand, the shepherdess's lonely song. To walk away from the circle, to keep her memories and her hard-won understanding, was to let that symphony play on, its sorrowful notes forever echoing through the forests she had come to love. It was to preserve the ghosts, to honor their stories by letting them remain, forever crying out in the dark. The other side was silence, a profound, absolute peace bought at the ultimate price. The descendants' words hung in the air, as solid and immovable as the stones around them. The ritual would work. It would draw the accumulated sorrow from the land, the interconnected suffering from every forest, and through her, as the conduit, it would be transmuted, quieted, laid to rest. But the energy required, the sheer psychic force needed to channel and transform such a vast ancient pain, would scour her clean. It would be a fire that consumed its own fuel. The memories, not just of the hauntings, but of the entire journey, the reason for it, the grandmother's stories that had sent her forth, the very shape of her purpose, would be the cost. She would achieve peace for the land, but she would forget the war. She would forget the ghosts, and in doing so, she would forget herself. The lunar eclipse began. It was not a slow dimming, but a voracious, creeping shadow that devoured the silver coin of the moon, painting it the color of dried blood. The world plunged into a deep, copper-tinted gloom, the heather turning black, the stones becoming hulking silhouettes against the unnatural sky. The air within the circle grew thick and heavy, humming with a power that was both terrifying and sublime. The ley lines, those silver rivers of energy she had seen, in her vision, became visible as faint, pulsating threads of light converging beneath the circle, a nervous system awakening for one final, cataclysmic discharge. The time for decision was over. The moment was now. She thought of the soldier's letter, the plea to break the cycle. She thought of the watcher's vision, the sacred duty of maintaining balance. She thought of the small, cold hand in the lickies, the desperate need for peace. They were not asking to be remembered, they were begging to be released. Her own desire to hold on to their stories, to keep them as her own, was a form of selfishness. True guardianship was not about possession, It was about sacrifice. It was about loving something enough to let it go. A profound calm descended upon her, a clarity sharper than any she had ever known. There was no choice, really. There was only the path forward. She stepped into the very center of the circle, where the lines of power crossed. She looked at the descendant, who gave a single slow nod of understanding and respect. Then she closed her eyes, and she began. There were no words to recite, no gestures to mimic. The ritual was not an external performance, but an internal surrender. She opened herself, not as a researcher or a chronicler, but as a vessel. She let down every wall, every defense, and invited the storm in. And it came. It was a torrent, a hurricane of memory and emotion that ripped through her. She felt the rope tighten around her own neck, the soot fill her own lungs, the spectral blade slice through her own thigh. She was the witch burning, the poet despairing, the miner trapped, the maid waiting. The interconnected suffering of a nation flooded into her, a searing, white-hot pain that was every pain at once. It was agony beyond imagining, a dissolution of the self into a sea of pure, undiluted sorrow. She did not fight it. She embraced it. She let it flow into her, through her, and as it passed, she focused every ounce of her will, her love, her empathy into a single silent command: be at peace. The energy did not vanish, it transformed. The screaming blackness of the trauma, channeled through the lens of her acceptance, began to shift, to soften. It bled from black to grey, from grey to silver, and then, finally, to a clean, clear white. It was the colour of forgiveness, of release. The pain was not erased, but its sting was drawn, its eternal echo stilled. It became history, integrated and quiet, rather than a live, bleeding wound. As the last of the energy passed through her and flowed back down into the receptive earth, a great silent wave of tranquility radiated outwards from the circle, rushing across the moors and into the forests beyond. In Epping, the whispers in the trees fell silent. In Thetford, the phantom drills ceased. In the dark hedges, the rustling leaves held their peace. All across the land, the unrest that had vibrated in the roots and the stones simply ended. The effort was absolute. As the moon began to emerge from the shadow of the earth, its light pure and silver once more, Elara felt the cost being exacted. It was not a violent tearing, but a gentle, inexorable leaching. The memories, so vivid a moment before, began to blur at the edges, their colours fading. The face of the soot-covered child softened into a pleasant, featureless smudge. The sound of the shepherdess's lullaby became a meaningless, distant hum. The terror of the banshee, the sorrow of the grey lady, the intellectual thrill of the puzzle, all of it drained away, like water into sand. She felt the shape of her grandmother's stories, the very compass of her life, dissolve into a warm, vague feeling of affection with no attached narrative. The leather-bound notebook in her pack was now just a book of incomprehensible scribbles. She was being hollowed out, the story of her journey rewritten into a blank page. Dawn broke, a soft golden light spilling over the eastern horizon, painting the moors in hues of rose and amber. The stone circle stood silent and empty, save for her. The descendant was gone, his purpose fulfilled. Elara stood up, her body feeling light, strangely new. She looked out at the world. The heather was beautiful. The sky was clear. The air was clean. A profound, deep silence lay over everything. A silence that was not an absence, but a presence, the sound of peace. She felt a profound sense of closure, of a vast, burdensome task completed, though she could not have said what it was. A transformation had occurred, not just in the land, but in her. She was someone new, someone lighter, unburdened by a past she could no longer recall. She took one last look at the circle of stones, feeling a distant, nameless gratitude for this place, and then she turned and began to walk back toward the path, toward a world that had been healed, leaving behind the ghost of the woman she had been, a necessary sacrifice for the dawn.